There is something underneath Britain that doesn't make sense. And I don't mean that in the way people say, things don't make sense just to sound dramatic. I mean it in the quiet, unsettling way that archaeologists mean it when they lower their voices in conference rooms and say, we don't actually know what this is. I mean it in the way that certain sites get excavated and then quietly refilled, not because there's nothing there, but because what's there raises questions that the official story hasn't found good answers to yet. Britain is a small island on the edge of Europe. That's the easy version. But the longer version, the one that takes years of digging and decades of radiocarbon dating and decades more of arguing about what the dates actually mean, that version is far stranger. That version involves stone structures older than the pyramids, alignments with stars that no Iron Age farmer should have known about, bones that don't belong, connections to cultures thousands of miles away that shouldn't exist, and layer after layer of human occupation, stretching back so far that the mind simply doesn't want to follow it into the dark. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know. Where are you right now, and what time is it? Britain before Rome, Britain before the Saxons, Britain before the Celts even, which most people never think about because the Celts feel ancient enough. But there's a Britain underneath all of that, and then a Britain underneath that, and then another one still, going down into depths of time where the people who lived there left no written record of their names or their languages or their gods, only the stones, only the shapes they cut into hills, only the bones they buried in chambers, aligned so precisely with the winter solstice sunrise that you have to conclude they were watching the sky for reasons we still don't fully understand. This script is an attempt to follow that strangeness as deep as it goes, not to sensationalize it, not to reach for ancient alien explanations or conspiracy frameworks, but to sit honestly with what the evidence actually shows and to admit, whenever we need to, that the honest answer is, we don't know, because sometimes we don't, and that's the most interesting place to start. Let's begin with something that most people learn in school and then forget almost immediately. Britain was not always an island. This seems obvious when you say it, because the last ice age ended around 12,000 years ago, and sea levels rose dramatically as the ice sheets melted and the land bridge that once connected Britain to continental Europe, the one archaeologists called Doggerland, gradually flooded until it was gone. But the full weight of what that means tends to slip through the fingers of historical consciousness without leaving much of a mark. Because what it means is that for thousands of years before Britain became an island, it was inhabited by people who are now almost entirely invisible to us. Their campsites are underwater, their hearths are buried under the North Sea. Their tools wash up occasionally on beaches in Norfolk and Suffolk, flint hand axes and scrapers and projectile points that make archaeologists go quiet for a moment when they realize what they're looking at. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and they didn't know they were living on borrowed time. They hunted red deer through forests that are now ocean floor. They followed rivers that now exist only as faint valleys, visible through sonar imaging beneath tens of meters of salt water. When the sea finally came, it probably came slowly enough that people noticed it happening over generations. Coastlines retreating, familiar marshes turning to tidal flats, hunting grounds becoming shallow bays, and then eventually becoming deep water that no one born after the flooding would ever see again. The researchers who study Doggerland now do so with a strange mixture of scientific precision and something that feels almost like grief, because what they're mapping is an entire world that we lost before anyone wrote anything down. A world that may have held a significant portion of the human population of Northwest Europe at the time. A world with its own geography, its own rivers and lakes and coastlines, its own patterns of seasonal movement and resource exploitation. And then one day, the consensus now suggests it may have ended very suddenly. Not by gradual flooding alone, but by something catastrophic. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, now called the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami somewhere around 8,000 years ago that researchers believe inundated the low-lying coastal areas of Doggerland with extraordinary speed. If people were there when it happened, and evidence suggests people were, then they had almost no warning. The wave didn't care about the camps on the shore, or the fires burning in the reed beds, or the children playing on the mudflats. It just came. What happened to the survivors of Doggerland is one of those questions that archaeology is just beginning to be able to ask in any serious way. Because until recently, the technology didn't exist to look at the seafloor with the resolution needed to identify human sites. Now it does, slowly, expensively, and with results that are already reshaping what we think we know about the ancient human occupation of northwest Europe. Bone harpoons have been trawled up by fishing boats working the banks of the North Sea for more than a century. And for a long time, nobody paid much attention to them. They were curiosities, the kind of thing that might sit on a shelf in a fisherman's house without anyone fully grasping what they were. But systematic analysis of the material coming up from the North Sea floor has now confirmed that there are preserved organic remains down there, animal bones, worked flint, at least one human skull that was radiocarbon dated to the Mesolithic, pulled up in the nets of a trawler working the Leman and Ower Bank, a shallow plateau about 40 kilometers off the Norfolk coast. A person died there, or was placed there, in a place that is now under meters of seawater. Someone who didn't know that their world was ending. The people who came after, the ones who arrived in Britain after it had become an island, brought with them something that would transform the landscape so completely that we're still living in its shadow today. They brought farming. Neolithic farmers arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago, and they didn't just bring seeds and domesticated animals. They brought an entirely different relationship with the land. Where the Mesolithic hunters had moved through the landscape, reading it, following it, taking what it offered without fundamentally altering it, the Neolithic farmers began to reshape it. They cleared forests. They dug ditches. They built monuments. They raised the dead in ways that were so deliberate, so architecturally sophisticated, that archaeologists who study them still sometimes stop and just stare at the engineering involved. Because the Neolithic farmers of Britain were not simple people with primitive tools. They were people with an extraordinary capacity for coordinated labor, for long-term planning, for the kind of large-scale communal effort that we tend to associate with later, more complex societies. And they were doing all of this before the wheel was in use, in Britain, before bronze, before iron, before writing of any kind. The Long Barrows are where you feel this most strongly. These are the earliest major monuments of Neolithic Britain, and they are scattered across the landscape in their hundreds, from the chalk downlands of southern England to the limestone plateaus of the Cotswolds to the windswept uplands of Scotland and Wales. They are burial mounds at their most basic description, but that description flattens something that deserves more careful attention. Because the Long Barrows are not simply holes in the ground covered with dirt. They are engineered structures built with timber and stone and chalk rubble in configurations that reflect both sophisticated construction knowledge and an intimate understanding of how bodies decompose over time and what to do with them when they do. At West Kennet in Wiltshire, one of the largest and most well-preserved Long Barrows in England, the chamber at the heart of the mound held the remains of at least 46 individuals when it was excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the bones weren't randomly arranged. They were sorted. Long bones stacked in one area, skulls arranged in another. The people who built this place came back to it, repeatedly, over generations, and they reorganized the dead. They moved bones around. They brought new bodies in. They took things out. West Kennet was not a tomb in the way we think of tombs. It was a space that was actively used, a place where the community maintained a relationship with its ancestors that involved physical interaction with their remains. This is strange to us. It's worth sitting with that strangeness for a moment, because the impulse to dismiss it as simply different or simply primitive is a way of avoiding the actual weirdness of what was happening. These were people who understood, in ways we no longer do, that the dead had ongoing relevance to the living, that their bones were not just remains, but were things, almost like objects, that held significance and needed to be tended. Some archaeologists have suggested that certain Neolithic communities may have kept skulls of ancestors as objects that circulated among the living, perhaps brought out during ceremonies, perhaps carried during seasonal movements. The skulls found in the forecourt of West Kennet, placed there deliberately in the final act of sealing the chamber around 2500 BCE, were not the skulls of people who had recently died. They were old bones, carefully kept and then carefully placed. Somebody carried them. Somebody decided they belonged there, at the entrance, as a kind of threshold between the world of the living and the world that lay within. This practice of circulating human remains is not unique to Britain. Similar patterns appear in Neolithic context across Atlantic Europe, in Brittany, in Scandinavia, in the Iberian Peninsula. Which raises a question that archaeologists are increasingly willing to ask out loud. How connected were these communities? The traditional view of Neolithic Britain treats it as a relatively isolated development, farmers arriving from continental Europe, spreading gradually across the landscape, developing their monument traditions in relative independence. But the genetic evidence coming out of the last decade of ancient DNA research is painting a more complicated picture. The people who built the long barrows in Britain appear to have been part of a broader movement of Neolithic farmers who spread across Western Europe from origins in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey. They were not a single unified culture, but they were connected by ancestry, by the remarkable similarities in their monument traditions, by what appears to have been a shared cosmology that expressed itself in stone and earth across thousands of kilometers. And then, around 2500 BCE, something happened to them. The people who built the long barrows essentially disappeared from the genetic record in Britain. Within a few centuries, the ancient DNA of the British population shifted dramatically. A new group of people arrived, bringing with them a different ancestry, different pottery styles, and very likely a different language. These are the people archaeologists call the Beaker people, named for the distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels found in their graves. They came from the continent, from the steppes of Eurasia, via Central Europe, and within a few generations they appear to have replaced the long barrow builders so thoroughly that the descendants of the original Neolithic farmers account for only a small fraction of the British population afterward. This is one of the most dramatic genetic replacements in European prehistory. We don't know exactly how it happened. We don't know if it involved violence or disease, or simply a demographic expansion so overwhelming that the original population was absorbed and diluted almost beyond recognition. But it happened. The people who built West Kennet and the other long barrows across Britain were largely gone within a few centuries of the arrival of the Beaker people. And the Beaker people, or their descendants, went on to build Stonehenge. Stonehenge is the obvious place to go in any discussion of ancient British mysteries, and it's obvious partly because it is genuinely one of the most extraordinary human constructions ever made, and partly because it sits in the landscape of Wiltshire, so completely out of context with everything around it that the mind reaches for explanations and keeps grasping at air. But there's a version of Stonehenge that most people don't know, and it's more interesting than the postcard version. Because the Stonehenge that stands today is not the Stonehenge that was first built. It's not even the second or third version. Stonehenge is the result of at least 5 major phases of construction, spanning more than 1,500 years, beginning around 3000 BCE and continuing until roughly 1500 BCE. The site began not as a circle of standing stones at all, but as a circular earthwork enclosure, a ditch and bank arrangement with a wooden structure inside it. Cremated human remains were being deposited there from the very beginning, and they continued to be deposited for centuries. There are at least 60 cremation deposits at Stonehenge, possibly many more, representing individuals from across a surprisingly wide geographic range. Strontium isotope analysis of teeth from some of these burials indicates that the people being cremated and buried at Stonehenge were not all local. Some of them grew up in what is now West Wales. Some appear to have come from even further afield. Stonehenge was not a local monument. It was a place that drew people from across Britain and possibly beyond. The bluestones are the part of the story that keeps archaeologists arguing most intensely. These are the smaller stones in the inner circle and inner horseshoe at Stonehenge, and they are made of several different types of rock, all of which have been traced to the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, roughly 250 kilometres from Salisbury Plain as the crow flies, and considerably further by any land or sea route that would have been available in the Neolithic period. How 80 or more stones, each weighing several tons, were transported from Wales to Wiltshire is a question that has generated more theories than any other aspect of the Stonehenge puzzle. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that it's possible to move stones of this size using timber sledges, rollers, ropes, and coordinated human labor. But demonstration of possibility is not explanation of how. The logistical challenge is enormous, and it requires not just technology, but organization, motivation, and a degree of social coordination across very large distances that implies a level of political or religious authority that we don't otherwise have much direct evidence for in Neolithic Britain. One hypothesis that has gained serious traction in recent years is that the bluestones were not transported from Wales by the people who built Stonehenge. They were already in Wiltshire when construction began, having been deposited there much earlier by glacial action during the Ice Age. This would explain the transport without requiring the extraordinary feat of moving multi-ton stones hundreds of kilometres. But the evidence for glacial deposition in that specific part of Salisbury Plain is not conclusive, and the debate continues with considerable heat on both sides. What makes the bluestone question interesting beyond the purely logistical puzzle is the question of why. Why those particular stones? Why from those particular hills in Wales? Because the Preseli Hills are not just any hills. They are a landscape with its own extraordinary archaeology, including springs and outcrops that appear to have been treated as sacred places long before Stonehenge was built. The stones may have been chosen not just for their physical properties, but for what they already meant, for the power attributed to the place they came from. The sarsen stones, the large upright stones and lintels that form the familiar outer circle, and the great trilithons at the heart of Stonehenge are a different story. They came from Marlborough Downs, about 25 kilometres to the north, and they are massive. The largest standing sarsen weighs around 25 tons. Moving them would have required hundreds of people working in coordination over days or weeks, using sledges, levers, and an understanding of terrain and logistics that represents a genuine engineering achievement. The precision with which the lintels were fitted onto the uprights, using mortise and tenon joints carved into the stone itself, is remarkable. These are carpentry joints. The people who built Stonehenge were applying woodworking techniques to stone, presumably because those techniques worked, and they knew it from experience with timber construction. This is a clue about how they thought. They were not starting from scratch. They were adapting existing knowledge to new materials. Stonehenge is oriented so that on midsummer morning, the sun rises over the heelstone, and its first light falls along the central axis of the monument into the heart of the structure. On midwinter morning, the setting sun aligns in the opposite direction, casting its dying light through the great trilithons. The astronomical precision of these alignments has been known and debated for decades, and it's real. It's not imagined or projected. The alignment exists, and it was deliberate. But what it meant is another question entirely. Was Stonehenge a solar temple, a place for ceremonies marking the passage of the year? Was it a monument to the dead, a place where ancestral remains were brought in connection with the cycles of the sun? Was it a calendar, a territorial marker, a stage for political ritual? The answer is probably all of these things, and none of them cleanly, because the people who built it didn't leave us a guide to their intentions. What they left us is the thing itself, standing in the grey Wiltshire morning with its long shadows and its silence, and the way it makes you feel small and curious and slightly unmoored from the present in a way that very few human-made things can manage. The wider landscape around Stonehenge is, in some ways, even more interesting than Stonehenge itself. The monument does not stand alone. It stands within a ritual landscape that extends for kilometres in every direction, filled with burial mounds, processional avenues, circular enclosures, and traces of activities that span thousands of years. The Stonehenge cursus, for example, is an enormous rectangular enclosure, roughly 3 kilometres long and 100 metres wide, oriented almost exactly east to west. That predates the stone monument by several centuries. Nobody knows what it was for. Its sheer scale suggests it was significant. It would have required an enormous amount of labour to construct the ditches that define its boundaries. but its function remains genuinely unknown. It's not a burial monument in any obvious way, it's not a settlement. It's a form that seems to have had a purpose, and that purpose has been swallowed by time. The Durrington Walls is a much later enclosure, contemporary with the Sarsen building phase of Stonehenge, and it's one of the largest Neolithic enclosures in Europe, enclosing an area of roughly 17 hectares. Recent excavations there have revealed evidence of enormous feasting events, quantities of animal bones, particularly pig and cattle, that suggest gatherings of hundreds or possibly thousands of people. The Stonehenge landscape was not a place people simply visited and left. It was a place people came to in large numbers, for events that involved eating, drinking, and presumably ceremony, on a scale that makes it something more like a pilgrimage site than a local monument. And the avenue, the processional way that links Stonehenge to the river, Avon, 2.5 kilometers away, follows a course that was partly shaped by natural periglacial ridges in the chalk. Ridges that happen to align perfectly with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. The avenue appears to have been built along a natural feature that already possessed the right alignment, as if the builders recognized something in the landscape that resonated with what they were trying to create, and built with it, rather than imposing something entirely new upon it. Moving north and west from Wiltshire, the landscape of ancient Britain opens up into something that the tourist literature tends to ignore almost entirely. Because the stone circles and ancient monuments of Scotland are in some ways even more extraordinary than those of Wiltshire, and in some ways even less understood. The Orkney Islands, an archipelago off the northern tip of Scotland, have been called the cradle of Neolithic Britain, and the evidence supports that claim. The cluster of Neolithic monuments on mainland Orkney, the main island of the group, is so dense and so well preserved that it has reshaped how archaeologists think about the complexity of Neolithic society in Britain. The Ness of Brodgar is the most significant recent excavation, and it has been transforming the field since serious work began there in 2008. What's emerging from the peat and rubble of the Ness is a complex of monumental stone buildings, some of them with walls over 4 meters thick, connected by flagstone paved roads, equipped with drainage systems, decorated with painted geometric designs. This is not a settlement in any ordinary sense. The scale of construction, the quality of the stonework, the evidence of repeated feasting on a massive scale, all of it points to something closer to what we might call a ceremonial centre, a place that served an administrative or religious function for a much wider population than could have lived on Orkney itself. The decorated stonework at the Ness of Brodgar is one of the details that tends to stop people cold when they encounter it for the first time. Because painted Neolithic stonework is not supposed to exist in Britain, or rather, it's not supposed to have survived, which is a slightly different thing. But at the Ness, the sheltered environment of the buried structures has preserved pigment, red and orange ochre applied in geometric designs on stone surfaces. Zigzags, lozenges, parallel lines, designs that appear in Neolithic contexts across Atlantic Europe, from the megalithic art of the Boyne Valley in Ireland to the carved stones of the Passage tombs in Brittany. This is not coincidence. The people who built the Ness of Brodgar were connected, through trade, through movement, through the circulation of ideas, to communities across a vast stretch of the Atlantic facade of Europe. They were not isolated island farmers making do with what they had. They were participants in something larger, something networked across hundreds of kilometers of sea. The Ring of Brodgar, the great stone circle that stands a short walk from the Ness of Brodgar, is the third largest stone circle in Britain, and it sits between two lochs in a landscape that feels, even now, deliberately theatrical. The site was clearly chosen for its visual and spatial properties, a peninsula between water, elevated against the sky. The stones were raised around 2500 BCE, making them contemporary with the final phases of Stonehenge, and the circle they form is precisely calculated. The diameter is 103.6 meters, which is not a round number in any modern measurement system, but which translates exactly into 125 megalithic yards, a unit of measurement that the engineer Alexander Thom proposed in the 1960s to explain what he saw as a consistent unit of length, running through the dimensions of stone circles across Britain and Brittany. Tom's megalithic yard theory has been both influential and controversial. Critics argue that it represents the projection of modern metrology onto ancient structures, finding patterns that aren't really there. Supporters argue that the statistical evidence for a consistent unit of measurement is too strong to dismiss, and that if it's real, it implies a level of coordination across the monument-building cultures of Neolithic Britain that would be genuinely extraordinary. The argument continues, and the answer is still genuinely uncertain. What's not uncertain is that the Neolithic inhabitants of Orkney were extraordinary builders. Maeshowe, the great chambered cairn on mainland Orkney, is a case study in precision construction that leaves visitors unsettled in a way they often find difficult to articulate. The entrance passage is oriented so that around the winter solstice, for a few weeks on either side of the shortest day, the setting sun shines directly down the passage and illuminates the back wall of the main chamber. This alignment is not approximate, it's exact. The passage is perfectly calibrated to capture that specific phenomenon on those specific days, which required its builders to observe the sunset over multiple years to understand the precise angle at which it falls at the latitude of Orkney at that time of year, and to engineer a structure that captures it with stone walls that are, in places, fitted so precisely that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Maeshowe was built around 2800 BCE, making it somewhat older than Stonehenge in its current form. It was built by people who had no writing, no formal mathematics as we understand it, no measuring instruments beyond sticks and ropes and the patient observation of the sky. And it works. 5,000 years after it was built, on the winter solstice, the sun still lights the back of that chamber. Inside Maeshowe, there is another layer of history that most visitors don't think about: the Norse runic inscriptions. In the 12th century CE, Viking raiders, or Norsemen, sheltering from a storm, broke into the mound and left behind the largest collection of runic inscriptions found outside Scandinavia. More than 30 inscriptions cover the walls of the chamber, ranging from the mundane to the evocative. Some are names, some are boasts, some are references to treasure, a motif that recurs enough times that some scholars believe there may have been a genuine tradition of a treasure being hidden within the mound. One inscription reads simply, "Many a woman has walked stooping in here." Another, "Ingibiorg the fair widow, many a woman has come stooping here." They were tourists. They were sheltering Vikings sitting in a 5,000-year-old chamber, scratching their names into the walls by whatever light they had, in a space that was already ancient when Rome fell. The layers of time in that chamber are vertiginous. The Neolithic builders who aligned the passage with the winter sun. The community that used it for centuries afterward, until it was sealed and forgotten. The Norse carvers who broke in a millennium later and left their names on walls that had been dark for longer than their civilization had existed. And the modern visitor who walks in now and stands in the chamber and tries to hold all of those layers at once. The connections between Orkney and the rest of Neolithic Britain are deep, and they run in both directions. Grooved ware pottery, a distinctive style of ceramic characterized by grooved geometric decoration, appears to have originated in Orkney and then spread south, eventually appearing at Stonehenge and at Durrington Walls and at sites across Britain. This is remarkable because it implies that Orkney, this remote archipelago at the northern edge of Britain, was not a backwater. It was, in some sense, a centre, a place from which cultural innovations radiated outward. The idea of Orkney as a cultural heartland of Neolithic Britain is still being absorbed by the archaeological community, partly because it runs counter to a long-standing assumption that important things in British prehistory happened in the south, in the chalklands of Wiltshire and Dorset, and the periphery received and adapted what the centre generated. The emerging picture is considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. There is a site in County Meath in Ireland, just across the water from Britain, that belongs in this conversation, even though it's technically in a different country. Newgrange is a passage tomb built around 3200 BCE, making it older than both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids. and it is, in some ways, the most spectacular of all the megalithic monuments of the North Atlantic. The mound is enormous, covering more than a hectare, and its facade was decorated with white quartz cobbles, some of which have been restored to give a sense of how it would have looked in its original state, blazing white against the green Irish hills, visible for kilometres in every direction. But the architectural achievement that makes Newgrange truly extraordinary is the roof box. Above the entrance passage, there is a small opening, the roof box, that was specifically engineered to admit light, while the main passage entrance remained blocked. On and around the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight enters through this roof box and travels 19 meters down the passage to illuminate the chamber floor for approximately 17 minutes. This was not an accident. The corbelled roof of the chamber, a remarkable feat of stone construction that has kept the interior dry for 5,000 years, was built with a carefully calculated slope that feeds the light exactly where it needs to go. The people who built Newgrange understood geometry, understood astronomy, understood stone, and understood something about the meaning of light entering darkness at the darkest time of year that we can only guess at. The Boyne Valley, the landscape in which Newgrange sits, contains not just one passage tomb, but a complex of monuments, the most important of which are Noath and Dowth. Noath is in many ways even more extraordinary than Newgrange. It has two passages, oriented in opposite directions, one aligned to the equinox sunrise and one to the equinox sunset. And the quantity of megalithic art at Noath is astonishing. Over 200 decorated stones, spiral designs, lozenges, circles, arcs, geometric abstractions that repeat with variations across the surfaces of the curbstones, passage walls, and chamber slabs. Some of this art appears to represent astronomical observations. One stone in particular, Stone 52 at Noath, has been interpreted by some researchers as a lunar calendar, a record of the moon's phases across a month inscribed in stone over 5,000 years ago. Others are more cautious about such interpretations, noting that we lack the framework to read these symbols with any confidence. But the sheer density and sophistication of the art, combined with the astronomical alignments of the passages, suggests minds that were engaged with observation and record-keeping in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. What were these people doing? Not just at Newgrange and Noath and Stonehenge, but across the whole vast network of megalithic monuments that stretches from Orkney to Portugal, from Ireland to Denmark. There is a theory, advanced most prominently by the archaeologist Mike Parker Pearson and his colleagues, that the monument landscapes of Neolithic Britain were organized around a fundamental conceptual division between the land of the living and the land of the dead. Timber structures, which decay and rot and are impermanent, were for the living. Stone structures, which endure, were for the dead. The rivers and water boundaries between them served as thresholds, liminal zones where the two realms could be connected during ceremonial events. This framework makes sense of a lot of the evidence. The timber circles at Woodhenge and Durrington walls, the settlement evidence at the Ness of Brodgar, all on the living side of the equation, associated with feasting and habitation. The stone monuments, Stonehenge, the passage tombs, the long barrows on the other side, associated with bone and ancestral remains, and the kind of permanence that stone implies. Water between them as a literal and metaphorical threshold. It's a beautiful theory. It's also probably incomplete, because the past has a way of being messier than our theories about it. What seems clear is that for these communities, the dead were not simply gone. They were present in a different way, and that presence required maintenance, required architecture, required the investment of enormous communal labor in structures that would endure, not just for lifetimes, but for generations upon generations. There is something in that investment that speaks to a sense of continuity across time, a desire to be connected to the future, in the same way they sought connection to the past, through the bones of their ancestors. They were building for people who hadn't been born yet. They were building things they knew they would never see completed, because some of these monuments took generations to construct. That kind of long-range intentionality is not something we often attribute to prehistoric people, but the evidence demands it. Now let's go somewhere that doesn't appear in most histories of ancient Britain, because most histories of ancient Britain don't think about what was happening in North America at the same time. And this matters because there are researchers, a small but serious group, who have been arguing for decades that the connections between the megalithic cultures of Atlantic Europe and the ancient cultures of North America are not just theoretical parallels but evidence of actual contact. This is where we need to be careful, because the field is mixed with some legitimate scholarship and a lot of wishful thinking, and separating them requires patience. But the evidence that has emerged in recent decades from archaeological sites on the eastern seaboard of North America and from genetic analysis of ancient American populations has begun to reshape what was once a completely settled question about when and how and from where the Americas were populated. The standard model, the one taught in classrooms for most of the 20th century, held that the Americas were populated exclusively by people crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Asia in the period between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, and that these Siberian-derived people were the ancestors of all Native American populations, with no other significant source of genetic input until Europeans arrived in 1492. This model has been challenged, revised, and in some respects overturned by the evidence of the last 20 years. The genetic story of the peopling of the Americas is now understood to be considerably more complex. There appear to have been multiple waves of migration from Asia. There is evidence of a population in Amazonia, represented by the Surui and related groups, that has genetic affinities with Australian Aboriginal populations and Melanesians, suggesting a source population in Southeast Asia or the Pacific that arrived in the Americas by a route and at a time that don't fit neatly into the Bering Land Bridge model. And there is an ongoing argument, not yet resolved, about whether there is any genetic signal in ancient or modern Native American populations that could reflect contact with Atlantic Europe before Columbus. The Solitrean hypothesis is the most controversial piece of this puzzle. It was proposed in a serious academic form by the archaeologists Dennis Stamford and Bruce Bradley, and it argues that people from the Solitrean culture of Ice Age Iberia and southwestern France made their way to North America by crossing the Atlantic, following the edge of the sea ice, during the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago. Their evidence is primarily technological. The Solitrean stone tool tradition of Europe, characterized by thin, finely worked bifacial projectile points, shares striking similarities with the Clovis stone tool tradition of North America, which appears in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago. Stamford and Bradley argue that these similarities are too specific to be explained by independent invention, and that they reflect a technological tradition that crossed the Atlantic. The genetic evidence for the Solitrean hypothesis is not strong, and most population geneticists remain skeptical. The archaeological evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The critics of the hypothesis have strong arguments, but the proponents have not been silenced, and the debate itself has forced a useful reconsideration of assumptions about what was and wasn't possible in terms of ocean crossings in deep prehistory. What is not in serious dispute is that people were crossing significant bodies of water much earlier than the traditional model allowed. The Australian continent was reached by humans at least 50,000 years ago, a sea crossing that required navigating stretches of open ocean, even at low sea levels. The settlement of the Pacific Islands, culminating in the extraordinarily skilled maritime navigation that brought Polynesian people to Hawaii and New Zealand and Easter Island, demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything we tend to attribute to prehistoric peoples. And there is now accumulating evidence that the first Americans arrived on the Pacific coast of North America by boat, not by walking through an interior corridor, and that they were doing so earlier than the Clovis tradition, perhaps as early as 16,000 years ago. If people were capable of open ocean navigation at these time depths, the question of whether Atlantic crossings were possible becomes at least worth asking seriously. But let's move from the contested and speculative to something that is documented and yet still deeply puzzling. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of the northeastern coast of North America had a tradition, recorded by early European colonists and missionaries, of veneration for certain types of stone chambers and large standing stones that they encountered in the New England landscape. These stone structures, found across Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York, have been the subject of a long and sometimes heated argument between mainstream archaeologists, who generally attribute them to colonial-era farmers using stone to mark their fields and build root cellars, and a smaller group of researchers, including some Native American community members, who argue that at least some of them predate European contact and represent a tradition of stone construction connected to indigenous ceremonial practice. The stone chambers of New England are genuinely puzzling physical objects. They are small, dark, often corbelled, stone rooms set into hillsides or rising from the ground in forest clearings, sometimes with entrance passages aligned to astronomical events. The chamber at Calendar 1 in Vermont, for example, has an entrance passage oriented to the autumn equinox sunrise. The America's Stonehenge site in North Salem, New Hampshire, a complex of stone walls, standing stones, and chambers spread across several acres, has multiple alignments to solar and lunar events that its proponents argue reflect deliberate astronomical calibration. The mainstream archaeological community is skeptical of pre-contact dates for these structures, pointing to the presence of tool marks consistent with iron implements, the general morphological similarity to colonial root cellars, and the lack of demonstrably pre-contact artifacts in direct association. The counter-arguments point to structures that would have been entirely impractical as root cellars, to Native American oral traditions that associate certain stone constructions with ceremonial use, and to the statistical improbability of so many accidental astronomical alignments. The honest position is that some of these structures are almost certainly colonial root cellars, that some may be genuinely ambiguous, and that a small number may deserve more serious investigation than they have received. The controversy has unfortunately been inflamed by enthusiasts on both sides who have allowed their conclusions to run well ahead of their evidence, making it harder for careful scholarship to get the attention it deserves. But the underlying question, whether indigenous peoples of northeastern North America had a tradition of working in stone for ceremonial purposes before European contact, is a legitimate one, and the answer is almost certainly yes, even if the specific New England structures remain contested. What is clear and documented and not in dispute is that the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America had complex relationships with the landscape, with astronomical cycles, and with stone that were entirely their own, developed over thousands of years of occupation, and that these traditions were largely destroyed or obscured by the catastrophic population, collapse and cultural disruption that followed European contact. The epidemics that swept through Native American communities in the decades after European arrival killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the population in many regions. Entire cultures, entire bodies of knowledge, entire traditions of practice were lost, not through conquest alone, but through biological catastrophe. What survived was what managed to hold on through the chaos, and what survived is only a fraction of what existed. This matters to the story of Britain, because one of the most persistent threads in the study of ancient Atlantic connections is the idea that the megalithic monument-building tradition of Neolithic Europe reflects a cosmological framework, a set of ideas about the relationship between the living, the dead, the sky, and the land that may have been more widely distributed across the North Atlantic than we have been willing to acknowledge. The ethnographic record of northeastern North American peoples, fragmentary as it is, contains elements that bear striking resemblance to what archaeologists infer about the beliefs of Neolithic Europeans. The veneration of ancestral remains, the ritual significance of specific landscape features, the use of astronomical observations to structure ceremonial calendars, the belief in spirit beings associated with particular places in the landscape. None of these are unique to any one culture, and their presence in both contexts does not prove contact. But they are part of a pattern that some researchers find suggestive. Barry Fell was an unconventional figure in this field, a Harvard marine biologist who became convinced in the 1970s that there was extensive pre-Columbian European inscription left across the landscape of North America, particularly in New England. His books, most notably America BC, published in 1976, argued for inscriptions in Ogham, the alphabetic script used in early medieval Ireland, Celtic, Iberian, and other scripts carved on stones and in caves across the northeastern United States. Fell's work was embraced enthusiastically by the popular press and dismissed with equal enthusiasm by mainstream archaeologists who pointed to misreadings of natural rock fractures as letters, to translation methods that were not linguistically rigorous, and to the absence of any corroborating archaeological context for the inscriptions he claimed to have identified. The consensus among professional archaeologists is that Fell's inscriptions are not genuine, but the volume and persistence of claims about anomalous inscriptions in New England have kept the question alive, and occasional new discoveries keep it from disappearing entirely. One of the more interesting documented cases involves the Bourne stone, a fragment of a larger stone found in the 18th century in Bourne, Massachusetts, which carries markings that have been interpreted by some as a Phoenician inscription. The stone is real. The markings are real. The interpretation is disputed, with mainstream scholars reading the marks as indigenous petroglyphs and a minority reading them as Semitic script. The stone is now in the Aptuxet Trading Post Museum in Bourne, and it sits there being quietly puzzling without anyone having definitively resolved what it actually is. That comfortable ambiguity, the object that could be one thing or another and refuses to conclusively be either, is characteristic of this whole field. The Phoenicians bring us to a thread that connects back across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, and through the Mediterranean to the ancient world more broadly. The Phoenicians were extraordinary maritime traders, operating from their base in what is now Lebanon and extending their trade networks across the entire Mediterranean and beyond. They established colonies at Carthage in North Africa, at Cadiz in southern Spain, which is itself built on or near the site of the ancient Tartessian culture, whose relationship to the Phoenicians is complicated and interesting. They had ships capable of open ocean voyaging. There is credible classical documentation of a Phoenician expedition commissioned by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II around 600 BCE that circumnavigated Africa, traveling from the Red Sea down the East African coast and returning through the Strait of Gibraltar, a voyage that took 3 years. If Phoenician sailors could circumnavigate Africa, they could in principle have reached the Americas, following favorable currents and trade winds. The currents and winds of the North Atlantic, including the Gulf Stream, actually provide a reasonably efficient route from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean if you're willing to go where they take you. Whether the Phoenicians actually reached the Americas is a question that generates more enthusiasm among amateur researchers than among professionals. The evidence is suggestive in places and thin in others. There are reports from the 16th century Spanish missionaries of copper artifacts in the American Southwest and Midwest that were worked in ways consistent with Old World metallurgical traditions. There are claims, disputed but not entirely dismissed, of Roman amphorae found on the seafloor off the coast of Brazil. There is the persistent puzzle of cocaine and tobacco residues found in Egyptian mummies, plants that should not have been available in the Old World before Columbus, which has been documented in peer-reviewed literature but hasn't generated a satisfying consensus explanation. And there is the mystery of the so-called Hindu-Arabic numerals, which appear to have been independently developed in Mesoamerica, raising questions about whether the mathematical traditions of the two hemispheres developed in complete isolation. None of this constitutes proof of contact. What it constitutes is a set of anomalies, things that don't fit neatly into the standard model of isolated hemispheric development that deserve investigation rather than dismissal. The history of our understanding of human prehistory has been a history of repeatedly discovering that ancient people were more capable, more mobile, more connected than previous generations of scholars assumed. The revision of the Clovis First model, the recognition of Neolithic exchange networks, the discovery that even Homo sapiens were not the only hominins to leave Africa, all of these have required revising assumptions that seemed settled. The appropriate response to anomalies is investigation, not closure. Let's come back to Britain, because there's a thread running through the British archaeological record that connects directly to some of these questions about long-distance contact in deep prehistory. It concerns copper. Britain has sources of copper ore in Wales, in Cornwall, in the Lake District. But the period in which copper metallurgy took off in Britain, beginning around 2200 BCE with the arrival of the Beaker people, was also a period of dramatic expansion in copper production across Atlantic Europe. The copper axes, daggers, and ornaments of the early Bronze Age in Britain are part of a broader phenomenon in which metal objects were being produced and traded across enormous distances. Tin, which is necessary to make bronze, is found in very few places in Europe. Cornwall in southwestern England is one of them. Brittany in northwestern France is another. The Erzgebirge Mountains of what is now Germany and the Czech Republic are a third. Control of tin sources in the Bronze Age was economically and politically significant in ways that probably drove trade and exchange across the whole of Atlantic Europe. The Bronze Age tin trade brings us to a specific historical claim that occupies a peculiar position in British history. Somewhere between myth and lost knowledge, the Phoenician tin trade with Britain. Classical sources, including Pytheas of Massalia, a Greek navigator who made a voyage to the British Isles around 325 BCE, describe a place called the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, from which Phoenician and other traders obtained tin. The location of the Cassiterides has been debated for centuries, with Brittany, the Scilly Isles off Cornwall, and Cornwall itself all proposed as candidates. What's not disputed is that tin from Cornwall and the other Atlantic sources was reaching the Mediterranean world in the Bronze Age, and that this trade had to involve maritime voyaging across considerable distances. The Phoenicians, or their Carthaginian successors, were the most capable maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean, and it would be surprising if they were not involved in the Atlantic tin trade. What Pytheas himself reported about Britain and the far north is extraordinary. He described a place called Thule, 6 days' sail north of Britain, which he said was at the edge of the frozen sea, where in summer the night was very short and the midnight sun could be observed. Modern scholars generally identify Thule as somewhere in Iceland or Norway, which would mean that Pytheas's voyage took him further into the North Atlantic than any surviving classical text describes. He also described the inhabitants of the British Isles in terms that suggest genuine contact and observation. He described their use of threshing barns because the climate was too wet to thresh grain in the open air. He described their production of mead. He described the aspects of their social organization and their treatment of the dead. These are not the details you get from rumor and second-hand report. These are the details of someone who actually went there and paid attention. Pytheas was a scientist in the ancient sense. He was making astronomical observations to determine latitude. He understood the relationship between the tides and the moon. His account of the northern voyage was dismissed by ancient writers, including Strabo, as fantasy. But modern analysis suggests that most of what he reported is consistent with what we would expect from an accurate observation of the places he claimed to have visited. The connection between Cornwall and the ancient Mediterranean world is embedded in the local landscape in ways that are easy to miss. Chun Castle is an Iron Age hill fort on the western tip of the Penwith Peninsula, the toe of Cornwall, one of the most remarkable and least visited ancient sites in Britain. It's a double-walled circular enclosure of granite, set on a hilltop, with views that extend in every direction across the sea, and it's surrounded by a landscape so densely packed with ancient monuments that walking across Penwith feels like moving through a corridor of time. Within a few kilometres of Chun Castle, there are standing stones, ancient field systems, a fogu, an underground stone-lined passage of uncertain purpose, and several of the characteristic beehive-shaped stone huts, known as courtyard houses, that are unique to the far west of Cornwall. This landscape was occupied continuously from the Neolithic through the Iron Age and into the early medieval period, and the evidence of its occupation forms a palimpsest, layer upon layer of human use, inscribed in stone and soil. The Fogus of Cornwall are among the most puzzling of all the ancient structures on the British landscape. These are stone-lined underground passages, most of them roughly rectangular in cross-section, sometimes with side chambers, invariably dark and cold. They are found in association with Iron Age settlements, and their function has been debated for as long as they've been studied. Storage chambers, bolt holes for people or animals, ceremonial spaces, cold rooms for food preservation. The range of suggestions reflects the genuine uncertainty. No two fogus are identical. Some are very long, others short. Some have elaborate entrance arrangements, others simple openings. Excavations have generally produced disappointing amounts of diagnostic material, making it difficult to determine what they were used for. What's clear is that they were built with considerable effort, stone-lined and roofed, and that they were integral to the settlements in which they occur rather than accidental or marginal features. There is a tradition in Cornwall that connects the Fogus and the underground landscape, more broadly, with the small folk, fairy beings associated with the earth and with the entrances to underground realms. This tradition parallels similar traditions across Celtic Britain and Ireland, in which specific features of the landscape, particularly ancient monuments, are associated with supernatural beings and with thresholds between the ordinary world and the other world. These are not simply children's stories. They are the residue of a way of understanding the landscape that goes back very far, a way of marking places as significant, as liminal, as requiring careful attention and appropriate behavior. The ancient monuments of Britain were not anonymous or meaningless to the people who lived near them in the medieval period and after. They were incorporated into a living body of law and practice that provided them with ongoing meaning, even as their original purpose was forgotten. The fairy traditions of Britain and Ireland are interesting from the perspective of deep history because of the hypothesis, associated most prominently with the folklorist David McCritchie, writing in the late 19th century, that the fairy traditions reflect cultural memory of an earlier, smaller, technologically different population that was displaced but not entirely eliminated by later arrivals. McCritchie argued that the underground dwellings of the fairies corresponded to the actual dwelling practices of Mesolithic or Neolithic peoples who lived in pit houses or used natural cave systems, and that the stories of fairy folk emerging from mounds corresponded to memories of communities that used the long barrows and passage tombs as habitations as well as burial places. This hypothesis was taken seriously for a while, then largely dismissed, and has recently been revived in modified form by a few researchers who see in it at least a partial truth. The idea that oral tradition can preserve genuine historical memory across very long periods of time has been demonstrated for other cases, notably the Aboriginal Australian stories that appear to preserve memories of coastline changes associated with the end of the last ice age, events that occurred more than 10,000 years ago. The British fairy traditions are not so old, but they may be older than they look. The Green Children of Woolpit is a story from 12th century Suffolk that has never been entirely explained to anyone's satisfaction and remains one of the strangest episodes in medieval English history. The account, recorded by two independent chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, describes the appearance at the village of Woolpit of two children, a boy and a girl, emerging from one of the pits used to trap wolves that gave the village its name. They were speaking an unknown language, wearing unusual clothing, and their skin was distinctly green in colour. They refused to eat anything except raw broad beans, and the boy sickened and died shortly after their discovery. The girl gradually lost her green colour as she adopted a normal diet, learned English, and was baptized. She lived for many years, and in later life told her interlocutors that she had come from a land underground, a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never shone directly, but where there was a luminous sky, and that she and her brother had been following their sheep through a cavern and had emerged suddenly in the sunlight of Woolpit, not knowing how to return. The story has generated explanations ranging from the mundane, children suffering from chlorosis, an iron deficiency condition that can cause a greenish skin tone, who had wandered from a Flemish settlement and were speaking a Flemish dialect, to the fantastical. None of the mundane explanations are entirely satisfying. None of the fantastical ones are provable. The story sits there, recorded by two serious medieval chroniclers who clearly believed they were recording something real, and resists resolution. This resistance to neat resolution is characteristic of Britain's deepest history. The country is small enough to feel manageable, but old enough that it contains depths that simply cannot be sounded with the instruments available to us. The layers keep going down. Every time archaeology thinks it has a reasonably complete picture of a particular period or place, new excavation or new analytical technique reveals something that complicates it. The discovery in 2015 of the Stonehenge Bluestones' original quarry sites in the Preseli Hills, specifically two quarries called Carn Godog and Rossi Felin, pushed back the date of bluestone quarrying by several hundred years and revealed that the stones may have been taken from pre-existing monument structures at the quarry sites, meaning they were already ancient and already meaningful when they were moved to Wiltshire. The builders of Stonehenge may not have been choosing their stones purely for lithological reasons, but were literally dismantling and relocating monuments that already existed, carrying not just stone, but the accumulated significance of those stones' original context. This idea of monuments being built from the materials of older monuments, of significance being transferred and intensified through the act of relocation, is one that appears in other contexts in the ancient world. Temple sites in the ancient Near East were often rebuilt on the same foundations repeatedly, with each rebuilding incorporating elements of the previous structure. The new temple was made continuous with, and more powerful than its predecessors, through the act of physical connection. Something similar may have been happening at Stonehenge, with the bluestones from Preseli carrying into the final monument the accumulated ceremonial power of their original Welsh context. The final phase of active use of Stonehenge as a major ceremonial site appears to have been around 1500 BCE, after which the monument seems to have gone into a kind of dormancy, still present in the landscape, still probably avoided or respected, but no longer actively maintained or significantly modified. The Bronze Age cultures that followed the monument-building climax of the Neolithic in Britain were no less sophisticated, but their monumental expression took different forms. Instead of raising enormous stones, they were burying their dead under small round barrows that dot the downlands of southern Britain in their thousands. Instead of building communal chambers for collective ancestral remains, they were placing individuals in single graves accompanied by personal possessions of increasing sophistication. Daggers with decorated hilts, amber necklaces, gold ornaments, bronze tools and weapons. The shift from collective to individual burial is one of the most significant changes in the British archaeological record, and it may reflect a corresponding shift in social organisation toward a more hierarchical society in which individual identity and personal status, expressed in death through grave goods, became more important than the collective ancestral identity expressed in the shared chambers of the long barrows. The Rillaton Gold Cup is one of the objects from this period that catches the light in a particular way. Found in a barrow on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall in 1837, it's a small gold vessel with a corrugated surface and a decorated handle, dated to around 1500 BCE. It's beautiful, precise, and technically accomplished. It was found in a grave alongside other objects including a bone pin and fragmentary pottery. The person buried with the Rillaton cup was someone of considerable status, but the cup itself has a provenance that adds a layer of strangeness to its story. After its discovery, it disappeared into the royal household and was reportedly used by King George V as a shaving mug before its significance was recognised, and it was eventually transferred to the British Museum, where it now sits in a case being quietly extraordinary. The path from a Bronze Age barrow on Bodmin Moor to a royal bathroom and then to a museum case spans 3.5 millennia in a journey that would make a strange short story. The cup itself, indifferent to its own history, just continues being golden. The Bronze Age in Britain was not an isolated period. It was connected, through trade and exchange, to the wider Bronze Age world that stretched from the steppes of Eurasia to the eastern Mediterranean. The spread of bronze technology itself was not simply a matter of metallurgical knowledge diffusing across Europe through word of mouth. It required the movement of actual materials, tin and copper, which are not universally available, over long distances. The tin of Cornwall was almost certainly a significant commodity in this exchange network, and through the trade routes that moved tin and copper and finished bronze objects, other things moved too: ideas, designs, styles, people. The amber that appears in high-status British Bronze Age graves came from the Baltic. The blue faience beads found in Wiltshire barrows were made in a style that originated in the eastern Mediterranean. The interconnectedness of the ancient world consistently surprises people who are accustomed to thinking of prehistoric societies as small and local and isolated. They were not. The amber roots and the tin roots and the copper roots of the Bronze Age laid the infrastructure, in a sense, for the trade networks of the Iron Age that followed. The coming of iron to Britain, around 800 BCE, was not an abrupt technological revolution that swept away everything that came before. It was a gradual process of adoption and adaptation, occurring against a backdrop of continuing social and cultural change that had its own internal logic. The people who adopted iron technology in Britain were the ancestors of the people the Romans would later identify as Celts. Though the relationship between the Iron Age inhabitants of Britain and the continental Celtic cultures is more complex and contested than the popular image of Celtic Britain suggests. The languages that would eventually produce Welsh, Cornish, and Scottish Gaelic were present in Britain long before the iron-using cultures that archaeologists label as Celtic. Celtic languages may have arrived in Britain as early as the Bronze Age, possibly earlier, and the iron-using cultures of the later first millennium BCE may have been Celtic-speaking without being Celtic in any ethnic sense that would have been meaningful to those who used the label. What the Romans found when they arrived in Britain in 55 BCE with Julius Caesar's reconnaissance expeditions, and again in 43 CE with Claudius's actual conquest, was not a simple society of painted barbarians. They found a complex landscape of competing kingdoms, long-established trade connections with the continent, sophisticated metalwork and art, coastal settlements engaged in active commerce, and a religious tradition centered on figures the Romans called Druids, who exercised significant social and political authority. The Druids are worth dwelling on because they represent one of the most significant gaps in our knowledge of ancient Britain. We know of them almost entirely through Roman sources, which are by definition hostile and external, and through the archaeological record of the Iron Age, which tells us about practice rather than belief. What the Druids believed, what their cosmology actually contained, what their ceremonies actually involved, is almost entirely lost. The Romans destroyed the Druidic centre at Anglesey in 60 CE with a deliberate thoroughness that suggests they understood it as the heart of organized resistance to Roman rule, and with it went whatever institutional knowledge the Druids had preserved. What the Romans left is their own record of an encounter with something they found both impressive and disturbing. Caesar describes the Druids as the learned class of Gaulish and British society, responsible for the teaching of young nobles, the adjudication of legal disputes, the conduct of religious sacrifice, and the preservation of what he says was an enormous body of knowledge, memorized in verse and transmitted orally, kept deliberately unwritten on the grounds that writing would weaken the memory and corrupt the tradition. Caesar says that Druidism originated in Britain and was exported to Gaul, not the other way around, which would make the British Isles the heartland of this tradition, rather than a provincial branch of a continental phenomenon. If that's accurate, it places Britain at the center of a sophisticated intellectual and religious tradition, spanning the whole of Atlantic Europe in the centuries before the Roman conquest. The sacred groves of the Druids, the Nemeton, were places in the landscape marked out as belonging to the gods, where ordinary human activities were suspended and different rules applied. Caesar describes human sacrifice in the context of Druidic ceremony, an image that has shaped the popular understanding of Druids ever since. The archaeological evidence for human sacrifice in Iron Age Britain is real, but less straightforward than the Roman accounts suggest. Bog bodies, the preserved remains of people who died in or near wetlands and whose bodies were protected from decay by the anaerobic, acidic conditions of peat bogs, provide the most direct evidence. Lindo Man, found in a Cheshire bog in 1984, shows evidence of a triple death: blow to the head, strangulation, and throat cutting, combined with evidence that he was in good health and had recently eaten a meal containing mistletoe pollen, a plant with specific druidic associations in classical sources. The interpretation of Lindo Man as a ritual sacrifice is contested, with some researchers preferring explanations involving murder or execution. But the evidence is consistent with a deliberate, structured killing of a particular kind, whatever that means in context. The bogs of Britain and Ireland have been giving up their dead for centuries, and the bodies they contain span a remarkable chronological range. The earliest are Neolithic. The most recent are from the medieval period. They represent a cross-section of human experience across thousands of years, and many of them show evidence of violent death. What the bogs preserve that ordinary burial cannot is soft tissue, and with soft tissue comes information. The last meals of the bog, people have been analysed, finding evidence of plant foods, grains, and in some cases, specific combinations of ingredients that appear to have symbolic, rather than purely nutritional significance. The skin of the bog people has been examined under magnification, finding tattoos in some cases, evidence of disease, evidence of hard physical labour, evidence of a life lived in a body under conditions very different from anything most modern people experience. These are people now, not just artifacts. They had faces. Several of them, reconstructed from the preserved skull beneath the tanned skin, have been given faces by forensic artists, and the result is always slightly shocking, because the face looking back from the photograph is undeniably human, undeniably present, across a gap of 2,000 years. The Celts of Britain in the last centuries before the Roman conquest were producing metalwork of extraordinary sophistication. The Battersea Shield, found in the Thames in 1857, is a ceremonial bronze shield of the late Iron Age, decorated with enamel inserts in a curvilinear design of such complexity and elegance that it has been described as one of the masterpieces of European decorative art. It was never meant to be used in battle. Its surface is too thin for that, and the enameled decoration would have been destroyed immediately on impact. It was made to be seen, to be displayed, possibly to be offered to the river from which it was recovered, as part of a practice of votive deposition in water that is attested across the whole of Celtic Britain and Ireland. The Thames alone has yielded an astonishing quantity of Iron Age metalwork, from swords and daggers to helmets and horse equipment to personal ornaments and religious objects. These were not things dropped accidentally. They were deposited deliberately, given to the river. The river received them and kept them, and now they sit in the British Museum and the Museum of London, and they are beautiful in a way that stops the conversation when you encounter them unexpectedly. The Horned God is one of the most enduring images from Iron Age Britain and Gaul, known primarily from the Gundestrup cauldron, a large silver vessel found dismantled in a bog in Denmark in 1891. One of the interior plates of the cauldron shows a figure seated cross-legged, holding a torque in one hand and a serpent in the other, wearing antlers surrounded by animals. This is Cernunnos, the name given to this deity type by a single surviving inscription from Paris. Though the image appears dozens of times across Celtic Europe without always being labelled, the cross-legged posture, the association with animals, the torque as an attribute of divine or royal authority, all of these are consistent across the representations and suggest a coherent deity concept rather than a randomly recurring motif. What Cernunnos represented in actual belief and practice is largely beyond our ability to recover, but the persistence and consistency of the image across Celtic Europe suggests something important about how these communities understood the natural world and their relationship with it. The Romans, when they came, brought with them not just legions and governors, but an entire system of administration, architecture, literacy, and cultural assumption that would permanently alter the British landscape. The Roman occupation of Britain lasted nearly 4 centuries, from 43 CE to the withdrawal of the last Roman forces around 410 CE. In that time, they built roads that still underlie the modern road network in places, constructed cities where before there had been only seasonal settlements or hill forts, established a literate administrative class, introduced new crops and agricultural techniques, and built, along the northern frontier of the province, the single most impressive piece of military architecture in the ancient world outside of China. Hadrian's Wall, stretching 80 Roman miles from the Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne, was not just a defensive structure. It was a statement of intent, a physical inscription on the landscape declaring, here is the boundary of the known world, and it was built and garrisoned by soldiers from across the empire, from North Africa and the Levant and the Danubian provinces, and Gaul and Spain. Men speaking a dozen languages, bivouacking on a windswept northern frontier in a climate their bodies were not designed for, serving a power structure centered on a city most of them would never see. The forts along Hadrian's Wall have yielded extraordinary quantities of writing. Not grand official documents, but ordinary human communication. The ink-on-wood writing tablets found at Vindolanda, the Roman fort just south of the wall, are among the most remarkable surviving documents from ancient Britain. They include military reports, requisition lists, personal letters, invitations to birthday parties, complaints about the behavior of the locals. One fragment is a letter from a soldier telling his mother that the weather is terrible and he needs warm socks and underwear. 2,000 years across, the son complaining about the cold to his mother is a communication that requires no translation. These tablets, preserved in the waterlogged soil of the Vindolanda site, are a window into daily life in Roman Britain that no other source provides, and they are still being found. Every excavation season at Vindolanda produces new documents, new voices from the northern frontier, and each one is a small miracle of survival against all odds. When the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, the infrastructure they had built began to deteriorate, but the people who remained were not reverting to some pre-Roman condition. They were attempting to maintain and adapt the complex systems the Romans had established, without the administrative and military support that had kept those systems functioning. The cities contracted but did not immediately empty. The villas fell into disuse, but the land around them continued to be farmed. The roads, made of such solid construction that they would outlast the empire that built them by centuries, continued to provide the skeleton of the landscape's movement patterns. And into this complicated post-Roman Britain came new arrivals from the continent, the people the later tradition would remember as Angles and Saxons and Jutes, Germanic-speaking peoples who settled in the eastern and central parts of the island in increasing numbers through the 5th and 6th centuries. The period between the Roman withdrawal and the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms is one of the most contested and least documented in British history. It's the period from which the legend of Arthur comes, and the uncertainty of the historical record has made it a kind of screen onto which each generation projects its own preoccupations. There was no King Arthur in the sense of the medieval romance tradition, no Camelot, no Round Table. But there may well have been a military leader of the Britons in the late 5th or early 6th century who won significant victories against the Anglo-Saxon incursions, victories that were remembered and magnified into legend by subsequent generations who needed a story of resistance and survival. The name Arthur appears in Welsh poetry of the early medieval period in contexts that suggest a real figure of recent memory rather than a purely mythological construct. What he actually was, whether he was a single person or a composite of multiple figures or a title rather than a name, is beyond recovery from the existing evidence. What the evidence does show is that the transition from Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England was neither as rapid nor as complete as the older historical accounts suggested. Genetic studies of modern British populations show that there is no simple divide between a Celtic West and an Anglo-Saxon East of the kind that the traditional narrative would predict. The genetic contribution of the incoming Anglo-Saxon populations to the overall British gene pool was significant but not total. There was absorption and intermarriage, as well as displacement and replacement. The story of early medieval Britain is not a story of one people replacing another, but of populations mixing and transforming under circumstances of political upheaval and cultural change. while the land beneath them continued to do what it had always done, to receive the dead and yield the living and hold the stones. The stones don't forget. That's the thing about them. Everything that happens on the surface, the kingdoms that rise and fall, the languages that come in on the tide and recede, the beliefs that take hold and are replaced by other beliefs, all of it passes over the surface of a landscape that contains within it the deep history of what was there before. Walking across Salisbury Plain on a clear morning, with the dew still on the grass and the light coming in at a low angle from the east, the barrows rise on either side, and the line of Stonehenge appears on the horizon. And the sense of time's depth is physical. It gets in through the skin. You don't think about it so much as feel it. A pressure from below, from the weight of everything that happened in this place before the present moment, which is itself just another thin layer on top of all the rest. The chalk figures are another expression of this layered relationship with the landscape. The Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex, a figure cut into the chalk of the Downs, holding two staves, is the largest representation of the human form in Britain at 72 meters tall. Its age is uncertain. Some researchers place it in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. Others argue for a medieval origin. The figure has been modified multiple times, most recently in 1874, when it was outlined in yellow bricks to make it more visible from a distance. What lies beneath those bricks, in the chalk itself, may contain evidence that could resolve the dating question, but that evidence is not yet accessible without disturbing the monument. The White Horse of Uffington in Oxfordshire is rather better dated. The stylized horse figure, with its abstract, almost modernist lines, has been dated by optically stimulated luminescence to the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, roughly 3,000 years ago. It's remarkable that this figure has been maintained for that long, because without periodic cleaning, the grass grows over it and it disappears. Someone has been coming back to it every few years, across 3 millennia, to clean it out and keep it visible. That continuity of attention across so many generations is itself a kind of monument. The Kerne Abbas giant, the large figure of a man with an erect phallus cut into the chalk of a hillside in Dorset, has been claimed as everything from an ancient fertility deity to a 17th century political satire directed at Oliver Cromwell, whose enemies called him a giant and compared him to Hercules, which the figure also resembles. The historical documentation for the giant before the 17th century is thin, and the fact that no medieval records mention it, despite the medieval tendency to record such things as either curiosities or objects of folk devotion, has led some researchers to conclude that it's not ancient at all. Others argue that the silence of the records reflects the deliberate suppression or simple ignoring of pagan monuments by Christian authorities who preferred not to acknowledge them. The giant remains stubbornly undated and unexplained, which is in its own way fitting for a figure whose most prominent attribute is associated with generation and the stubborn persistence of life. The persistence of pre-Christian sacred sites into the Christian period is one of the more interesting threads in British religious history. The Church made a deliberate policy, articulated explicitly in a letter from Pope Gregory the Great to the missionaries he sent to Britain in 597 CE, of repurposing existing sacred sites rather than destroying them. If the pagans had gathered at a particular spring or hillside or ancient stone for their worship, build a church there. Channel the existing reverence for the place into the new faith. Don't try to eradicate the association. Transform it. The result is that a significant number of British churches stand on or very near sites that were sacred in the pre-Christian period. Wells in churchyards that were venerated as holy wells before Christianity arrived. Churches built within the ditches of Iron Age hill forts. Churchyards that preserve the circular shape of enclosures that predate their Christian use. The Christianization of Britain was not a simple replacement of one thing with another. It was an overlay, a superimposition of one sacred geography on top of another, and both layers remain visible if you know how to look. Avebury is the best place in Britain to see this superimposition at work. The Great Stone Circle at Avebury, or rather the great complex of stone circles, for there are multiple rings within the outer bank and ditch, is larger than Stonehenge and in some ways more impressive, precisely because it's still embedded in the landscape of a living village. The village of Avebury was built inside the ancient monument. Its houses and its pub and its church occupy the spaces between the standing stones and within the earthwork banks. Medieval villagers, needing stone for building, systematically toppled and buried many of the original standing stones, and the buried stones have been re-erected in the 20th century. But some of the original stones still stand in their original positions, including a massive stone that the village built itself around, incorporated into the garden walls of a house, part of the domestic landscape of everyday life for centuries, before anyone decided it was important enough to preserve. The coexistence of the prehistoric and the medieval at Avebury is not a careful museum arrangement, but the organic result of people living in a landscape that was already old when they arrived. The Avebury complex is connected to Silbury Hill, the largest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe, a flat-topped artificial hill 40 meters high and 500 meters in circumference, built in stages beginning around 2400 BCE. Silbury Hill has been tunneled into and excavated repeatedly, most recently in the early 2000s, and the investigations have found that it contains an earlier mound beneath it, and that the primary mound was built with extraordinary care, with a stepped structure of chalk and clay that formed the internal skeleton of the final mound. What Silbury Hill was for is entirely unknown. No burial has been found within it. No artifacts of significance have been recovered from its interior. It required an estimated 18 million man-hours of labor to construct. It took decades or centuries to build. And it doesn't do anything that we can detect. It simply sits in the Wiltshire Valley, enormous and present and completely resistant to explanation. The last major investigation of its interior filled the old Victorian tunnel with concrete to prevent collapse and left the questions it was meant to answer still unanswered. The relationship between Silbury Hill and the Swallowhead Springs, which lie a short walk to the east and were the source of the River Kennet before the springs were altered by road building in the 19th century, has been proposed by various researchers as significant. Springs, sources of water emerging from the earth, were consistently venerated in the ancient world as places of power and transition, entrances to an underground realm. The alignment of Silbury Hill with the springs and with other features of the Avebury landscape has led some researchers to propose that the entire complex was oriented around the hydrological features of the valley. That water was central to the cosmology of the people who built there. This is speculative, but not unreasonable. Water appears consistently in the votive depositions of Iron Age Britain and in the ritual landscapes of the Bronze Age. The springs at Bath were sacred long before the Romans built their temple of Sulis Minerva there. The practice of leaving offerings in springs and rivers was already ancient when the Romans arrived. The hot springs at Bath are genuinely remarkable. Thermal springs of this kind, where geothermally heated water emerges at the surface at a constant 45 degrees Celsius, are rare in Britain. The Bath springs have been flowing without interruption since at least the Iron Age, and possibly much longer. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the spring suggests the site was in use as a votive deposit site from at least the 1st century BCE, possibly earlier. When the Romans arrived, they found a spring already sacred to a goddess the Britons called Sulis, and they identified her with their own Minerva, giving the resulting temple the compound name Aquae Sulis. The great lead curse tablets found in the spring, over 130 of them, are among the most extraordinary documents from Roman Britain. These are thin sheets of lead, rolled or folded and thrown into the sacred water, inscribed with petitions to the goddess. The tablets are almost entirely written by ordinary people, not administrators or soldiers or aristocrats. They're written by people who've had their cloak stolen, or who've been cheated by a business partner, or who've suffered some injury they can't prove in any human court. They're asking the goddess to cause the thief to lose their mind, or to bleed from every orifice, or to suffer whatever punishment she sees fit. But please return the stolen goods. Specific, practical, furious, funny, deeply human petitions, scratched into lead and offered to the water. 2,000 years across, The frustration of someone whose good cloak has been stolen is completely intelligible. The goddess Sulis survived the Roman period and the coming of Christianity in an attenuated form, preserved in the etymology of the place name and in folk memory associated with the waters. This kind of survival of divine names and divine associations across the massive cultural disruptions of the post-Roman period is characteristic of the deepest layers of British religious history. The landscape holds its memories. Specific places retain their significance across centuries and millennia, even when the language and the belief system and the ritual forms through which that significance was expressed have been utterly transformed. The holy wells of Britain, more than 1,000 of them, recorded from medieval documents and surviving local tradition, represent this kind of layered significance. Many of them were sacred in the pre-Christian period, associated with deities of springs and healing. They became Christian holy wells, associated with saints, many of whom appear to be thinly disguised versions of pre-Christian sacred figures. The well itself, the water emerging from the earth at a specific location, remained the object of veneration across the transformation of its religious context. The layering of the British landscape, prehistoric on top of Mesolithic, Bronze Age on top of Neolithic, Iron Age on top of Bronze Age, Roman on top of Iron Age, Anglo-Saxon on top of Roman, Viking on top of Anglo-Saxon, Norman on top of all of it, and then the further layers of the medieval and early modern and industrial and contemporary. This layering is what makes Britain so strange and so fascinating to those who are willing to dig into it, literally and figuratively. Every field in Britain has been ploughed and planted and harvested thousands of times. The soil has been turned and turned and turned until the stratification that archaeologists depend on for dating has been blurred and confused almost beyond recovery in the plough zone, the upper layer of earth affected by agricultural activity. And yet, the features cut into the ground, below the plough zone, the ditches and post holes and pits and buried stone walls, survive. They survive because they were cut deep enough, or because the soil that filled them has a different chemical composition from the surrounding soil, or because the stones placed in them disturb the earth in ways that aerial photography can detect as crop marks or soil marks when conditions are right. The crop marks of Britain, revealed from the air, have added thousands of sites to the archaeological map. Sites invisible on the ground, but rendered visible when seen from above, by the different growth patterns of crops above buried features. Ditches that were dug and then filled with soil promote richer, deeper plant growth. Stone walls buried by later activity produce thinner, shorter plants above them. The patterns visible from a light aircraft on a dry summer day, when crops are stressed and sensitive to variations in soil moisture, can map out entire Iron Age settlements and prehistoric enclosures that have left no visible trace at ground level. This aerial archaeology, pioneered in Britain from the 1920s onward, has been one of the most productive methods for understanding the density and complexity of the ancient landscape. And that landscape is far denser and more complex than most people imagine. Britain is not a country with a few famous ancient sites scattered across a largely blank historical canvas. It is a country in which almost every square kilometre contains evidence of human occupation across multiple periods, where the ancient is everywhere if you know how to look. The North American parallel to this, the question of how densely the pre-Columbian landscape of eastern North America was occupied and modified, is one of the most significant revisions in historical understanding of the last generation. The traditional image of the Native American landscape as essentially virgin wilderness, nature unmodified by human activity, waiting for European colonization to impose order on it, has been comprehensively demolished. The work of scholars like William Cronon, whose Changes in the Land examined the ecology of colonial New England, and Charles Mann, whose 1491 synthesized recent research on the size and complexity of pre-Columbian American societies, has made clear that the landscape Europeans encountered in the Americas was not a pristine wilderness. It was a managed landscape, as modified by human activity as any landscape in Europe, but modified differently through controlled burning, selective harvesting, the creation and maintenance of open parkland through regular fire management, and in some regions through agriculture and settlement on a scale that rivals anything contemporary in the Old World. The Mississippian cultures of the American Midwest and Southeast, which flourished between roughly 800 CE and 1600 CE, built mound complexes that in their largest examples rival the great monuments of the ancient world. Cahokia, near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now Illinois, was at its peak around 1100 CE, a city of perhaps 20,000 people, larger than contemporary London, with a central mound, Monk's Mound, that covers 6.5 hectares and rises 30 meters above the surrounding plain, making it larger by base area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The city of Cahokia extended across an area of roughly 15 square kilometers and was organized around a carefully planned central precinct that included plazas, mortuary temples, and a series of large wooden posts aligned with solar events, a structure that has been called Woodhenge by the researchers who excavated it. The comparison with the British Woodhenge and the broader Stonehenge complex is not just a naming coincidence. The organizational logic of Cahokia, a central sacred precinct oriented to astronomical events, surrounded by a planned community, connected by avenues and processional routes, is structurally similar in ways that may reflect the common solutions that complex societies arrive at when organizing sacred space. The Hopewell tradition, which preceded the Mississippian cultures in the Ohio and Illinois river valleys, produced earthworks of extraordinary scale and geometric precision between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, the largest prehistoric earthwork complex in the world, covers an area of more than 20 square kilometers and includes geometric enclosures of remarkable regularity. The Great Circle at Newark is 365 meters in diameter, a figure that has attracted attention because of its proximity to the number of days in a solar year, though the significance of this, if any, is debated. The octagon enclosure at Newark is aligned to the lunar maximum standstill cycle, an 18.5-year cycle in the moon's position on the horizon, a relationship that was noted in the 1980s and has since been confirmed by careful measurement. The Hopewell people were tracking the moon across its full 18.5-year cycle and encoding that tracking in their geometry. This is not simple observation. It requires systematic record keeping over a period longer than a generation, which means it requires a tradition of knowledge transmission across time, a cultural mechanism for preserving astronomical observations and passing them on. The connections between the astronomical orientation of North American earthworks and the astronomical alignments of the megalithic monuments of Britain are real at the level of basic observation, but uncertain at the level of causation. Both sets of cultures were tracking the same celestial objects, the sun, the moon, specific stars, because they were the same celestial objects visible from both hemispheres, though with some differences in which phenomena are observable at which latitudes. The fact that both built large communal monuments aligned to astronomical events does not prove contact. It may reflect the common human tendency to organize significant structures in relation to the cosmos, but it does raise the question of whether there were shared influences, ideas traveling across the Atlantic along trade routes that we haven't yet fully documented, that led to similar approaches in different continents. The Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, is one of the most extraordinary ancient monuments in North America, and its connections to British and European sacred traditions are striking. It's an effigy mound, a mound built in the shape of an animal, specifically a serpent approximately 401 meters long, undulating across a ridge above Brush Creek. The serpent's coiling tail is aligned to the winter solstice sunset, and its head is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. The date of the Serpent Mound's original construction has been revised repeatedly. Earlier assessments attributed it to the Adena culture, dating it to around 300 BCE. More recent radiocarbon dating has suggested a much later construction date, around 1070 CE, placing it in the Mississippian period. But there is also evidence of earlier use of the site, and the question of when the effigy was first constructed and when it was modified or reconstructed is not fully resolved. What's clear is that serpents were significant beings in the cosmologies of many North American indigenous cultures, associated with water, with the underworld, with transformation and power. The choice of a serpent form for the largest effigy mound in North America was not arbitrary. The serpent in Old World sacred traditions is equally pervasive and equally associated with wisdom, transformation, and the chthonic, the underground. The serpent in the hand of Cernunnos on the Gundestrup cauldron. The serpent associated with healing deities across the ancient Mediterranean. The serpent in the Garden of Eden as the agent of knowledge. The horned serpent of Celtic mythology. These are cultural expressions of an idea that appears to be very widely distributed across human prehistory, the idea of the serpent as a being of particular power and significance, associated with the earth and water and the depths. Whether this widespread distribution reflects a common origin in deep prehistory or a common human psychological response to snakes, which are genuinely powerful symbols for a primate whose ancestors evolved in environments where venomous snakes were genuine threats, is another of those questions where certainty is not currently available. The mound-building traditions of North America are not ancient history, in any simple sense. The people who built the mounds are the ancestors of living Native American communities. The Muskogee Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, all have cultural and ancestral connections to the Mississippian cultures that built the great mound centers. The forced relocation of these communities from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States in the 1830s, the Trail of Tears, severed physical connections between living communities and ancestral sites that had been continuously relevant to those communities for centuries. The effort to restore those connections, to repatriate ancestral remains, to reassert indigenous rights over ancestral landscapes, is an ongoing process that intersects in complicated ways with archaeological research. Understanding who built the mounds and what they meant requires listening to the descendants of those builders, not just analyzing the deposits archaeologists recover from them. This matters to our discussion of connections between Britain and North America, because one of the lessons of indigenous studies in North America is that oral traditions can preserve genuinely ancient historical knowledge across very long periods of time. If some North American communities preserve traditions that refer to ancestors who came from the sea, or to contact with people from across the water, those traditions deserve to be treated as evidence, not proof, but evidence, worthy of investigation rather than dismissal. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia and the Maritime Provinces have traditions that some researchers have argued describe Norse contact, which is historically documented at Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland around 1000 CE. If Norsemen were in North America, and they were, and if indigenous oral traditions remembered the encounter, the principle that oral tradition can preserve historical memory is demonstrated for the Atlantic context. The Norse presence in North America is the one case of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact that is undisputed among mainstream scholars, because the archaeological evidence at Lonzo Meadows is unambiguous. The site was excavated by Helge and Anstin Ingstad in the 1960s and has been carefully studied ever since. The Norse structures there are clearly dated to around 1000 CE. There is evidence of iron smelting, butter making using Norse techniques, and the presence of butternuts, a tree species native to areas further south, which suggests the Norse at Lonzo Meadows were travelling to more southerly regions, not just staying at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland. The extent of Norse exploration in North America, beyond the few confirmed sites, is unknown. The Vinland sagas, the Norse narratives of these voyages, describe multiple expeditions over a period of years, contact and conflict with indigenous peoples they called skraelings, attempts at settlement that ultimately failed due to conflict and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across the North Atlantic. What the sagas describe is consistent with what the archaeology reveals: a Norse presence that was real, but ultimately transient, unable to establish a permanent foothold in a land already inhabited by populations that outnumbered and could outmaneuver the Norse expeditions. The Norse connection to Britain runs much deeper than the North American voyages. The Viking Age in Britain began conventionally with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE and extended through centuries of settlement, conquest, and cultural exchange that left permanent marks on the English, Scottish, and Irish landscapes. The Danelaw, the region of northern and eastern England under Norse political control from the late 9th century, is still visible in place names. Settlements ending in by, Thorpe, Toft, Dale, all Norse place name elements, dot the landscape of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and Leicestershire. The legal and administrative vocabulary of English preserves Norse borrowings that reflect the areas of Norse expertise and authority. The word law itself is Norse: husband, window, anger, gift, fellow. These are Norse words embedded in the English language from the Viking period, as natural now as any native English vocabulary, no longer felt as foreign. The intimate intertwining of Norse and English culture in the Viking Age produced a hybrid that is still the foundation of modern English identity. The Orkneyinga saga, the Norse history of the Orkney Islands, describes a society in which the Norse jarls who controlled Orkney were building their own holes and graves in a landscape that was already saturated with ancient monuments. The Norse settlers of Orkney were living among the Neolithic passage tombs and the Bronze Age stone circles and the Iron Age brocks in a way that made those monuments part of their daily environment. They broke into Maeshoa and left their ruins. They built their own structures in proximity to or on top of earlier structures. The landscape was not a blank slate to them, but a layered reality they had to interpret and inhabit, and which they left their own marks on, even as they reinterpreted the marks left before them. The brocks of Scotland are another layer in this archaeological cake, and they deserve more attention than they typically receive. Brocks are large dry stone tower structures, unique to Scotland, built during the Iron Age, between roughly 200 BCE and 100 CE. They are among the most sophisticated dry stone constructions in the world, with walls built as double shells enclosing a hollow space, stairways within the wall thickness, and heights, in some cases, of 10 meters or more. The engineering required to build a broch, with walls that are structurally sound, that distribute weight correctly, that incorporate internal features without compromising structural integrity, represents a tradition of specialized knowledge developed over generations. The best preserved broch at Mousa in Shetland still stands to its full original height of 13 meters and has survived for 2,000 years in the exposed island environment without any modern maintenance. The people who built it knew what they were doing. What the brochs were for is a question that has been discussed extensively and remains without a definitive answer. Some were clearly in locations that suggest defensive intent, built in commanding positions overlooking vulnerable coastlines or valley approaches. Others were built in positions with no obvious defensive advantage, suggesting that the tower form had a significance beyond pure military utility. Status display, the tower as a statement of political authority and communal wealth, is one explanation. The sheer labor involved in constructing a broch would have been a significant communal investment, and the finished structure would have been visible across large distances, a marker of the power of the community that built it. Whatever their primary purpose, the brochs are a monument to the same kind of communal technical capability that produced the passage tombs and the stone circles, the same capacity for coordinated long-term construction effort in service of goals that extended beyond immediate practical necessity. The Picts, the people who occupied much of Scotland north of the Fourth Clyde Line during the Roman and post-Roman period, remain one of the most tantalizing mysteries of British history. They left behind a remarkable body of carved stone monuments decorated with symbols that appear in consistent combinations across hundreds of stones and that have not been satisfactorily deciphered. The Pictish symbol system is the only major iconic system from early medieval Europe that remains unread. It may represent a form of writing, though it doesn't look like any writing system we know. It may represent heraldic or totemic symbols indicating personal or clan identity. It may represent something else entirely, a system of communication or record that worked on principles we haven't yet identified. The symbols appear on standing stones, on cave walls, on portable objects. The most common ones are recognizable but unnamed: the double disc, the serpent, the crescent and V-rod, the Pictish beast, an animal shape that doesn't correspond to any known creature and that has been interpreted as an otter, a dolphin, an elephant, a seal, and several other things by different researchers. Whatever it is, it's consistent across a large geographic area and a period of several centuries, and it mattered enough to be represented on major carved monuments. The Picts were literate in the sense that they were in contact with Latin literacy and with the Ogham script brought by Irish missionaries and traders. Some Pictish stones have Latin inscriptions or Ogham alongside the native symbols, but the symbols themselves appear to predate, or at least exist independently, of these external influences. They seem to be doing something that Latin letters and Ogham cannot do, expressing categories of meaning that those systems weren't designed for, though what those categories are, we can only guess. The Pictish symbol stones were raised in the landscape as monuments, marking graves, commemorating individuals or events, establishing territorial claims, or serving religious purposes, possibly all of these. After the Picts were absorbed into the Kingdom of Scotland in the 9th century, their symbol tradition faded rapidly and was replaced by Christian iconographic traditions from which the native symbols are almost entirely absent. The Pictish symbols went from a living system to a dead one within a century or two, faster than any other major symbolic tradition in European history, except those destroyed by military conquest. What happened to the knowledge of how to read them died with the people who held it, leaving us with hundreds of stones carved with information we cannot access. This sense of lost knowledge, of information that was once available and is no longer, pervades the study of ancient Britain. The Druids memorized enormous bodies of knowledge and transmitted them orally across generations, refusing to commit them to writing on principle. And that refusal meant that when the Druidic tradition was disrupted by the Roman conquest and the subsequent Christianization of Britain, the knowledge went with the tradition. Gone. The Pictish symbol system was clearly communicating something to those who could read it, and the tradition of reading it died before anyone thought to record an explanation. Gone. The songs sung at Stonehenge, the stories told around the fires at the Ness of Brodgar, the prayers offered at Newgrange at the winter solstice, all gone. The stones remain, but the voices that interpreted them for their users, that gave them meaning within a living system of belief and practice, those voices are silent, and yet the stones endure. And in their endurance, they do something that the voices cannot, because voices exist in time and stones exist across time. A stone set in the ground 5,000 years ago is not historical in the way a document is historical. It's present. It occupies space in the contemporary world. You can stand beside it, touch it, walk around it, feel the afternoon shadow it casts across the grass. The stones of ancient Britain are not just evidence of the past. They are the past, continuing into the present, remaining available to whatever attention we choose to bring to them. And the attention we bring to them changes us, if we let it, in the way that contact with things much older and more patient than ourselves tends to change us. It instills a kind of proportion, a recognition that the present moment is not the culmination of history, but just another point along a line that extends in both directions beyond our ability to see. The astronomical alignments of the ancient monuments are one of the most direct ways in which this contact with deep time works. When you stand inside the entrance passage of Newgrange on the winter solstice morning and the light comes in for those 17 minutes, you are sharing an experience with every person who stood in that exact spot on that exact morning for 5,000 years, give or take a few decades for the slow drift of the solar alignment over millennia. Not metaphorically sharing it, but sharing it in the most literal sense. The light enters the same stone passage. It falls on the same stone floor, which is different now from the original floor, but the geometry is the same. The duration is the same. The quality of the light at that specific moment of the year, low-angled, golden, striking the darkness of a stone chamber like a needle of fire, that's the same. The people who waited in that chamber for the sunrise 5,000 years ago felt something come when the light came in. Whatever they felt, the moment that produced it is repeatable and has been repeated millions of times since they built the chamber, and is happening this morning at Newgrange, somewhere in Ireland, in the cold of a winter solstice dawn. The light is coming in. Britain keeps producing new surprises from its ground. The Sea Henge, a Bronze Age timber circle discovered on the beach at Home Next the Sea in Norfolk in 1998, exposed by a particularly low tide, consisted of a large inverted oak trunk surrounded by a ring of 55 small timber posts, their roots pointing outward. It was dated to 2050 BCE, and its preservation was due to the waterlogged conditions of the intertidal zone. The decision to excavate it and remove it for conservation was controversial, with some local people and pagans arguing that it should be left in place and allowed to continue its natural process of decay. The counter-argument that if it was left, it would simply be destroyed by the sea within a few years, won out. The timbers are now in the Lynn Museum in King's Lynn, preserved but removed from their context. The question of what Sea Henge was for has not been satisfactorily answered. The inverted tree, with its roots pointing to the sky and its branches buried in the ground, reverses the normal orientation of the living tree, and this inversion suggests a deliberate symbolic act, a turning of the world upside down, a connection between the world above and the world below through the medium of the tree. This tree as cosmic axis motif appears in many ancient cultures, from the Norse Yggdrasil to the axis mundi of various indigenous traditions. What it meant specifically to the people who built Sea Henge is unknown, but the form suggests a sophisticated engagement with ideas about the structure of the universe that is recognizable across cultures and time. The Cheddar Man is a name that most people know from a particular viral moment in 2018, when facial reconstruction, using ancient DNA, revealed that this individual, who lived in what is now Somerset around 10,000 years ago, had dark brown skin, blue eyes and dark hair, an appearance quite different from the light-skinned European appearance that generations of researchers had assumed for a Mesolithic British person. Cheddar Man is the oldest, near-complete human skeleton found in Britain, discovered in Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge in 1903. The cave itself had been occupied by humans long before Cheddar Man, with evidence going back to around 14,700 years ago, making it one of the longest continuously occupied prehistoric sites in Britain. The bones found in the cave from the older occupation are not simply burial remains. Some of them show evidence of cannibalism, specifically the defleshing and processing of human skulls to create drinking cups. This practice has been documented at several other European sites from the same period, around the time of the Magdalenian culture, and appears to have been deliberate and potentially ritualistic rather than simply a response to starvation. The skulls were carefully shaped, with the facial bones and base removed, and the remaining calvarium, the upper dome of the skull, worked into a vessel form. Someone made cups from human skulls in Gough's Cave 12,000 years ago, and we have no idea what ritual context that served, only that it was deliberate enough that it happened multiple times in the same place. The Cheddar Gorge is itself a remarkable geological feature, a deep limestone gorge cut by a river that now flows underground, with caves formed by the dissolution of limestone over millions of years, providing natural shelter that humans and animals used repeatedly across the whole of the Pleistocene epoch. Walking through the gorge now, with the cliffs rising sheer on both sides and the road threading through the bottom, you're walking through a space that has been used by humans for at least 45,000 years. The caves above the road level contain the bones of lions and hyenas and woolly rhinoceros, animals that lived in Britain during the Ice Age, interleaved with human artifacts and human bones. The whole of that geological time frame is right there in the cliff face, readable in the layers of sediments that have been slowly accumulating since before our species arrived on this island. Time is the real subject of ancient Britain, not the specific events, the migrations and monument buildings and religious transformations and conquests, though those are all interesting in themselves. The subject is the depth of the time within which all of those events occur, the sheer quantity of human experience that has been lived and died in this small space of land over an almost incomprehensible span of years. 45,000 years of human occupation, at minimum, possibly significantly more if the pre-Neanderthal hominin bones found at Boxgrove in West Sussex are any indication, dating to around 500,000 years ago and representing an early human presence in Britain. that would have looked very different from anything we typically mean when we use the word human. The Boxgrove hominin, known as Homo heidelbergensis, or possibly a related species, was not anatomically modern, but it was making tools, it was hunting large animals, it was doing things in Britain that represent genuine cognitive capability 500,000 years ago in a landscape that was at various times connected to Europe by land and separated from it by sea, depending on where in the long climate cycles of the Pleistocene any particular moment fell. 500,000 years. The mind slides off it. The distance between Julius Caesar's arrival in Britain and the present day is about 2,000 years. The distance between the Neolithic builders of Stonehenge and us is 5,000 years. The distance between the Boxgrove hominin and us is 500,000 years, a span 250 times longer than the whole of recorded history. In those 500,000 years, the hominins living in Britain were not us, though they were our relatives. They were people in the broadest sense, beings with large brains and social structures and the capacity for making things, but not people who would have been recognizable to us in the way that even the most distant of modern human ancestors, the cave painters of Lascaux, are recognizable. They were something other, and they were here in what is now Sussex, 500,000 years ago, napping flint on an ancient beach, hunting horses and rhinoceros, living their lives in a world so different from ours that even the climate and the geography were barely recognizable. That depth is what the stones hold, not just the centuries of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, though they hold those too, but the whole weight of human and pre-human presence in a particular piece of land across a time frame that resists comprehension. The stones don't know this. They are, in the end, just stones. But they are stones placed deliberately by minds, and those minds, however different from ours in the details of their beliefs and their languages and their daily lives, were engaged in the same fundamental project we are engaged in now. Trying to understand what it means to be alive in a world that is old and indifferent and magnificent. Trying to leave a mark that says, I was here. Trying to connect the present moment to the past and the future in ways that make the present moment feel less isolated and more meaningful. Trying to make sense of the sun and the moon and the stars and the fact of death and the mystery of where we come from and where we go. Britain is a small island, but the strangeness within it is very large. Every field has been walked and ploughed and buried and excavated. Every hill has been looked at from every angle. And still, every year, the ground gives up something unexpected. A hoard of Bronze Age gold, a Roman mosaic under a field in Wiltshire, a Neolithic enclosure picked out by drought marks from the air in a field in Northumberland that was ploughed and planted for decades with no one knowing what lay beneath. A Viking boat burial on the shore of an island in Orkney, known to local farmers for generations as the Mound in the Field, which turned out to contain one of the most extraordinary burial assemblages of the early medieval period. The ground is not exhausted. Britain has not given up all its stories. It's still holding things, still keeping things in the dark below the surface, still waiting for conditions to be right, for a particularly dry summer, or a particularly low tide, or a particular farmer's decision to plough an inch deeper than usual, to release the next piece of evidence into the light of a present that doesn't quite know what to make of it. That's the deep, strange truth of Britain. The deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. Not because the past was more bizarre than the present, though in some ways it was, but because the human need to make sense of existence has been expressed in this particular place for so long and in so many different ways and with so many different tools and materials and beliefs that the result is a landscape so dense with meaning that you can never quite reach the bottom of it. There's always another layer. There's always another question. There's always another stone that turns out to be standing for reasons no one has yet satisfactorily explained. And that inexhaustibility, that quality of being unable to be fully understood, is itself a kind of answer to the deepest questions. It says that humanity is older and stranger and more various than any single narrative can contain. That the story of who we are extends in both directions from any point we choose to start, and that the places where it becomes most visible, the stones in the morning light, the bones in the peat, The runes scratched into the walls of ancient chambers by men sheltering from a winter storm. Those places are worth attending to, even now, even late at night, even from a bed in the dark, with the sound of rain or traffic outside, and the screen glowing softly, and the mind beginning to drift toward whatever country the sleeping mind inhabits, which may not be so different, in its depths, from the country beneath the earth where all those ancient stones are still sitting in the dark, waiting patiently for the next question. Rest now. The stones are still there, where they've always been, under the same stars that watch them being placed, patient as the earth itself. They'll be there tomorrow, and the questions they carry, the deep, strange questions of a very old island, those will keep. There is a question that hangs over the whole of British prehistory, like morning mist over the downs. A question that mainstream archaeology tends to sidestep because it doesn't have a clean answer, and the absence of a clean answer is uncomfortable in a discipline that requires rigorous evidence before it will commit to a conclusion. The question is this: why here? Why does this particular island, this relatively small piece of land on the northwestern edge of Europe, contain such an extraordinary concentration of monumental prehistoric architecture? There are stone circles and passage tombs and long barrows across the whole of Atlantic Europe, yes, but the density and the complexity and the sustained duration of monument building activity in Britain, and particularly in the regions of Wiltshire, Orkney, and the wider Irish Sea Zone, is remarkable even by the standards of the Neolithic Atlantic world. Why were the people of this island investing such extraordinary amounts of communal labour into structures of such architectural sophistication across so many centuries, when by any rational economic calculation the labour would have been better spent on food production or shelter or defence? The honest answer is that we don't know. But several things we do know are suggestive. The chalk downlands of southern Britain, which are the landscape in which Stonehenge and Avebury and the long barrows of Wessex sit, were particularly well suited to the pastoralist economies of the Neolithic. Thin, well-drained soils that grew grass abundantly, supporting herds of cattle and sheep that were the primary source of wealth and protein. The monument landscapes of chalk Britain were also landscapes of agricultural surplus, places where communities could afford, in an economic sense, to divert significant labour from immediate subsistence activities into long-term construction projects. But surplus alone doesn't explain why the surplus was directed into stone monuments, rather than, say, into expanded agricultural territory or improved shelter. The surplus was channeled into monuments because the monuments were important in ways that we can infer but not fully understand, important to the social and cosmological organization of these communities in ways that made the investment worthwhile, or indeed necessary. The Neolithic in Britain was not a period of peace and plenty, despite the impression that might be conveyed by focusing exclusively on the monument building. There is significant evidence of violence in the skeletal remains of the Neolithic period, of interpersonal conflict, and what appears in some cases to be organized warfare. The Towton mass grave, which actually dates to the medieval period, is a well-known example of organized battlefield violence in British history. But the evidence for Neolithic violence is older and more widespread than many people realise. At Crow Hill in Yorkshire, at Hambledon Hill in Dorset, at sites across the British Neolithic landscape, there are skeletal remains that show evidence of violent death, of arrows embedded in bone, of skulls fractured by blows from stone axes. The hilltop enclosures known as causewayed camps, which appear to have been major gathering places for Neolithic communities, show evidence at some sites of assault and burning, evidence that these large social gatherings were not always peaceful. The relationship between violence and monument building is one that archaeologists have discussed with varying degrees of directness. Large construction projects require coordination and cooperation, which in turn require mechanisms for managing conflict and establishing authority. The monuments themselves may have served as focal points for the negotiation of social relationships, as places where competing groups could meet and interact under the framework of shared sacred obligation. The gathering that built or maintained the monument was also a gathering at which disputes were resolved, alliances formed, marriages arranged, and the social hierarchy negotiated. The monument was the occasion for the social interaction, and the social interaction was what the monument was really for. This is a model rather than a demonstrated fact, but it fits the evidence reasonably well. The hill forts of the Iron Age serve a similar function in the later archaeological record, though the social context is quite different. The great hill forts of southern Britain, Maiden Castle in Dorset, Danebury in Hampshire, Yarnbury in Wiltshire, Hambledon in Dorset, are among the most impressive earthwork constructions in Europe. Their massive ramparts and ditches, sometimes 5 meters or more in height and depth, represent an even more extraordinary investment of communal labor than the Neolithic long barrows, though concentrated into a shorter time frame and directed toward, more obviously, practical ends. Maiden Castle in particular is overwhelming in scale. Its outer rampart encloses an area of 19 hectares, and the eastern and western entrances are defended by an elaborate system of overlapping ramparts and ditches that would have made any direct assault enormously costly in lives. The people who built Maiden Castle were expecting to be attacked, and they built their defences accordingly. And they were attacked. The evidence from the eastern entrance at Maiden Castle tells a story of violence that was recovered with remarkable specificity in Mortimer Wheeler's excavation of the 1930s. A war cemetery dating to the Roman conquest of the site, around 43 to 44 CE, contained the remains of at least 38 individuals, many showing evidence of violent death. Sword cuts, iron ballista bolts embedded in spines. The injuries tell the story of a real battle, a Roman assault on a defended position, fought between professional soldiers with superior weapons and training and a local population defending their home. The defenders of Maiden Castle lost. Their community was relocated or absorbed into the new Roman pattern of life, and the great hill fort was abandoned as a settlement within a generation or two of the conquest. The earthworks remained, as they still remain, but empty of the life that had filled them. The Roman conquest of Britain is so well documented, relatively speaking, compared to everything that came before it, that it can feel like the point at which British history properly begins. But it's really just the point at which we start to have more than archaeological evidence to work with, more than bones and pottery and the shapes cut into the landscape. It's the point at which we get texts, however biased and partial. Caesar's accounts of his reconnaissance expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE give us the first literary description of the people of Britain, and even that brief description is interesting for what it reveals about how different Britain's Iron Age inhabitants were from Roman assumptions about barbarian peoples. Caesar describes the Britons as having chariots, which the Romans had long since abandoned as a form of warfare. He describes them as dyeing their bodies with woad, which would have made them blue in color in battle, a form of display that was apparently effective in terrifying opponents. He describes their agricultural practices and their social organization and their coastal settlements and the large populations of cattle. He was observing carefully, even if his observations were filtered through a Roman framework that categorized what he saw according to Roman concepts of civilization and barbarism. The woad painting is one of those details that has lodged itself in the popular imagination and refuses to leave, partly because it's vivid and striking, and partly because it represents something genuinely foreign to a Mediterranean observer. A practice of the body as battlefield display that has no direct Roman equivalent. Whether it was woad specifically or another blue dye, the practice of dyeing the skin before battle is attested in multiple sources and was apparently real. What it meant within the value system of the Iron Age Britons, whether it was apotropaic, intended to ward off harm, or simply terrifying to the opponent, or connected to some cosmological meaning associated with the color blue, or all of these, we don't know. But it's a detail that makes the people of Iron Age Britain feel real in a particular way, specific rather than generic, doing something distinctly their own. The torques, the twisted metal neck rings that appear constantly in the archaeological record of Iron Age Britain, are another detail of this kind. Gold torques of extraordinary quality have been found across Britain, the most spectacular being the Great Torque from Snettisham in Norfolk, a massive, twisted gold neck ring, weighing more than a kilogram, buried in a hoard along with many other torques and fragments of torques in the 1st century BCE. The Snettisham torques are technically extraordinary, made by twisting multiple gold wires into complex cable patterns and finishing them with elaborately decorated terminals cast in bronze or gold. The craftsmanship is of the highest order, representing a metalworking tradition, refined over generations by specialists who worked at the absolute limits of what their materials and tools could produce. Who wore these torques is uncertain, but their size and weight and material value suggest individuals of very high status. The torque is associated in classical sources with Celtic royalty and nobility, and its consistent appearance in the highest status burials of the British Iron Age confirms that it was a marker of the highest social rank. The Iceni queen Boudica, or Boadicea in the older rendering, is described in the Roman sources as wearing a great golden torque as she led her revolt against Roman rule in 60 or 61 CE. The revolt, which destroyed the Roman cities of Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, killing according to Tacitus around 70,000 Roman citizens and allies, was triggered by the Roman governor's treatment of the Iceni after the death of their king Prasutagus, who had left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to the Roman emperor. The Romans ignored the will, annexed the kingdom, flogged Boudica, and assaulted her daughters. The response was one of the most devastating uprisings against Roman imperial authority in the history of the province. Boudica's forces nearly ended Roman Britain before it had properly begun. The burning layers, the thick deposits of scorched debris, are preserved in the archaeological record beneath modern London and Colchester and St. Albans, dated to the mid-1st century CE, undeniable physical evidence of the Boudican revolt. The speed and completeness of the destruction is apparent in the deposits. People didn't have time to take their valuables with them. Hoards of Roman coins buried in the floors of houses, never recovered by their owners. A child's sandal, carbonized, in a Colchester shop. The physical evidence of people's lives ending without warning, in fire and destruction, that the Romans who survived described in terms of horror. Tacitus's account of the aftermath of the Roman legions under the newly arrived governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, catching the Boudican forces in a valley and annihilating them in a single engagement, is one of the few moments in the history of ancient Britain where we feel we have enough evidence from enough angles to see what actually happened, however imperfectly. Boudica is one of the figures from ancient British history who has been continuously reimagined by subsequent generations for their own purposes. The Victorian monument to her on the Embankment in London, showing her in a chariot with her daughters, was commissioned partly as a statement of Victorian imperial confidence, projecting back onto an Iron Age queen the qualities of martial virtue and national spirit that the Victorians prized in their own queen. But there is something in Boudica's actual story, beyond the Victorian myth-making, that is genuinely compelling. The response of a community to the abuse of its members, articulated through collective military action, led by a woman in a society that apparently had no objection to female military leadership, at a scale that terrified the most powerful military force in the Western world. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the specific events, there is something in that story that belongs to Britain in a particular way, something that reflects the long history of a people who were repeatedly overrun and never entirely subdued. The language of the ancient Britons, the Celtic languages that were spoken across the island before the Roman conquest, survived in the western and northern margins of the Roman province and in the unconquered north. Welsh, Cornish, Cumbrian, and Pictish were the descendants of the Iron Age British languages, and Welsh is the only one of these that has survived as a living language into the present, spoken by around 800,000 people in Wales today and by diaspora communities elsewhere. Cornish was declared extinct in 1777, when its last native speaker, Dolly Pentreath of Mousehole, died, but has been revived as a language of conscious cultural identity and is now spoken by some thousands of people, mostly as a second language. The survival of Welsh as a living language for 2.5 millennia, across the Roman conquest, the Anglo-Saxon settlement, the Norman conquest, and the long political subordination of Wales to England, is itself one of the most extraordinary facts of British history. Languages don't survive like that by accident. They survive because communities decide they matter, and generation after generation of Welsh speakers decided that their language was worth keeping even when keeping it was difficult and occasionally dangerous. The Welsh language preserves in its vocabulary and its literature fragments of the oldest surviving poetic tradition in Britain, and possibly the oldest surviving vernacular poetry in Europe. The poems attributed to the 6th century poets Taliesin and Aneurin, which survive in manuscripts from the 12th and 13th centuries, but which preserve, scholars believe, material of much earlier origin, give us a voice from the immediately post-Roman period, from the British successor kingdoms of the early medieval period, speaking in a language that was already ancient. The poem Y Gododin, attributed to Aneurin, commemorates a failed military expedition by warriors of the Gododin, a British kingdom centred on Edinburgh, against the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Bernicia at the Battle of Catraeth, around 600 CE. The poem is an elegy for the warriors who died, and it names many of them and describes their qualities and their fates in a way that is clearly based on historical memory, however transformed by poetic convention. One line in the poem refers to a warrior as being, despite his valour, no Arthur, which is the earliest unambiguous reference in literature to a figure of that name in a context that implies general recognition, a figure of supreme martial prowess being used as the benchmark against which other warriors are measured. Whatever Arthur was or wasn't, by 600 CE he was already a legend powerful enough to serve as a standard of comparison. The tradition of British resistance to outside domination runs through the entire history of this island, from the Iron Age tribes that fought Caesar and Claudius, through Boudicca's revolt, through the survival of the British kingdoms in the post-Roman chaos, through the Welsh resistance to English conquest, through the Scottish Wars of Independence. It's a thread that the island's geography helps to explain. Britain is an island, and islands impose a particular kind of consciousness. The sea is both barrier and highway, both protection and vulnerability. Being surrounded by water creates a bounded identity, a sense of this specific place as distinct from everything beyond the water, that shapes how communities understand themselves in relation to outsiders. The Mesolithic hunters of Doggerland didn't know they were living on borrowed time, but when the sea finally came and made Britain an island, the island consciousness that the sea created has been part of the British experience ever since. This island consciousness has expressed itself in curious ways across British history. The tradition of the matter of Britain, the body of legendary and historical material centred on King Arthur and the founding of the British nation, is one expression. The idea that Britain has a special destiny, a particular providential role in the history of the world, is another, appearing in various forms from Geoffrey of Monmouth's 12th century history of the kings of Britain, which claimed Trojan ancestry for the British people and a continuous lineage of British kings stretching back to Brutus the Trojan, grandson of Aeneas, through the Tudor dynasty's exploitation of Arthurian legend to legitimate their claim to the throne, to various forms of British exceptionalism in the modern period. These are not simply national myths of the kind that every nation generates. They are myths with a specific character, rooted in the physical geography of the island and in the long history of what has happened in this particular place, across what feels. When you stand in the right field on the right morning, like an almost geological span of time, Geoffrey of Monmouth's history is fascinating precisely because it blurs the boundary between history and mythology so completely that readers from his own time to ours have not always been sure which side of the line any given passage falls on. He drew on genuine historical sources, on the records of the Roman occupation, on the Welsh genealogical and legendary material, on Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, and on what he claimed was an ancient book in the British language brought to him by his colleague, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. The ancient book, if it existed, has not survived and may never have existed. But Geoffrey's synthesis of historical fact and literary invention produced an account of British history from the Trojan founding through the legendary kings of pre-Roman Britain, that was accepted as historical by educated readers for several centuries, and that preserved in its pages fragments of older tradition whose relationship to genuine history cannot always be easily determined. The story of Merlin in Geoffrey's account deserves particular attention because the figure of Merlin is almost certainly a composite of multiple earlier traditions, and some of those earlier traditions have genuine roots in the pre-Christian religious and political landscape of early medieval Britain. The historical Merlin, to the extent there was one, appears to be related to a figure called Myrddin in Welsh tradition, a prophet and seer associated with the aftermath of the Battle of Afteryd in 573 CE, who is said to have gone mad after witnessing the slaughter of that battle and lived wild in the Caledonian forest, speaking prophecies. This figure, the wild man in the forest with prophetic gifts, is related to a type that appears in Irish tradition as the Gaelt, the mad prophet, and in Scottish tradition in the figure of Lailecan. There may be a single historical person at the root of these traditions, or there may be a recurring cultural type, the prophet madman, that accumulated legendary material across several different individuals. Geoffrey's Merlin merged this prophetic tradition with the figure of an advisor and magician who guides the destiny of kings, a role that reflects the actual political and religious functions of learned men in early medieval courts, and that has its own deep roots in the Druidic tradition of Britain. The prophecies attributed to Merlin, which Geoffrey includes in a separate work, the Prophetia Merlini, are extraordinary documents, written in a deliberately obscure allegorical style that made them applicable to almost any historical situation, and therefore apparently confirmable across centuries of British history. Real prophecies, in the sense of accurate predictions about specific future events, they are not, but as a genre of writing that uses the authority of a legendary past figure to comment on present politics and present anxieties, they are remarkable. They were taken seriously as political documents throughout the medieval period, quoted in support of various claimants to the British throne, and consulted as guides to the shape of British destiny. The Merlin of Geoffrey of Monmouth, himself drawing on older traditions that reach back to the Iron Age and the Druidic world, is one of the most persistent and adaptable figures in British cultural history, a shapeshifter who belongs to no single period but wanders through all of them, advising and prophesying and connecting the present moment to a deeper past. The tradition of sacred kingship in Britain, the idea that the king was in some way the embodiment of the land, that his health and the land's fertility were linked, that his death might be required to ensure the land's renewal, is one that scholars of myth and religion have traced through the literary and folkloric record with varying degrees of confidence. It appears in the mythology of the Irish sacred kings, whose ritual union with the goddess of sovereignty was a central element of their inauguration. It appears in the Welsh legend of Bran the Blessed, whose wounded thigh caused the land to become waste, the Fisher King motif that runs through the Arthurian tradition in its many forms. It appears in the folklore of the divine or semi-divine kings of pre-Christian Britain, whose sacrifice, willing or compelled, was said to renew the land. And it appears in the bog bodies, at least some of which appear to represent individuals of high status, killed in a ritualized manner that may reflect some form of this tradition. James George Fraser's The Golden Bough, first published in 1890 and expanded through multiple editions into a 12-volume comparative mythology, built its entire edifice of argument on the premise that the priest-king of the sacred grove at Nemi in Italy, who maintained his position by killing his predecessor and could be challenged at any time by any man who broke a branch from the sacred tree and survived, was a survival of a universal practice of sacred kingship in which the king's ritual death renewed the cycle of vegetation and fertility. Fraser's methodology has been criticized extensively in the century and more since he wrote, and the specific universalism of his claims has not survived scholarly scrutiny. But the core observation that motivated his work, that there are remarkably consistent structural elements in the myths and ritual practices of many cultures that deal with the relationship between kingship, death, and the renewal of life. That observation has not been satisfactorily refuted. The pattern appears too consistently, and across too wide a geographic and temporal range, to be simply dismissed as coincidence or projection. The Green Man, the foliate head carved in hundreds of medieval churches across Britain, a human face from whose mouth, eyes and nostrils leaves and branches grow, is one of the most iconic images in British decorative art and one of the least explained. The motif appears in Roman architectural decoration, but becomes most prevalent in the Romanesque and Gothic church architecture of Britain and northern France from the 12th century onward. The name Green Man was coined only in 1939 by the folklorist Lady Raglan, who identified the image in English churches with the May King, the figure of the vegetation spirit of English folklore. The medieval churchman who commissioned the carvings may have intended something entirely different, some theological meaning now lost, or they may have been preserving and transforming an older tradition of foliate imagery without fully understanding its origins, in the same way that the church incorporated sacred springs and hilltop sites. The Green Man watches from the corbels and capitals of hundreds of British churches, sometimes overlooked by congregations who have walked beneath him for generations, and his meaning, whatever it was and whatever it now is, endures in its ambiguity. The ambiguity is, in the end, one of the most important things about the ancient and the mysterious in Britain. The ambiguity is not a failure of evidence or a gap in knowledge that will eventually be filled. It is intrinsic to what these things are, to how they work as cultural objects and sacred sites and repositories of accumulated meaning. A site that can be interpreted in only one way is a site whose meaning is exhausted. A site that can be interpreted in multiple ways, that yields different things to different observers and different generations, that resist the closure of a single definitive explanation. That site is alive. Stonehenge has been interpreted as a solar temple, as a healing sanctuary, as a monument to the dead, as an astronomical observatory, as a political statement of power, as a meeting place for communities from across Britain, as all of these things simultaneously. None of these interpretations is simply wrong. Each captures something real about what the site did and what it meant in different contexts and for different communities across the 3,500 years of its active use. The monument is larger than any single interpretation of it, and that largeness is what has kept it central to British cultural consciousness for so long. The same is true of the whole of Britain's deep history. It is larger than any single interpretation. The story of ancient Britain is not the story of a simple progression from primitive to civilized, though there is progression of certain kinds. It is not the story of a single people with a continuous identity, though there are real threads of continuity running through the archaeological and genetic and linguistic record. It is not the story of isolation, of a people developing in splendid remoteness from the rest of the world, though there are periods of relative insularity. And it is not the story of connection, of a people fundamentally shaped by influences from outside, though external influences are constant and real. It is the story of a place, a specific piece of the Earth's surface, being inhabited by human beings across an almost incomprehensible span of time, and of the different ways those human beings organized their lives and made sense of their world and marked the landscape with the evidence of their presence, and of what happens to all of that evidence when you look at it carefully and honestly and with a willingness to admit how much of it you still don't understand. The North American connections, the question of what was happening across the Atlantic while all of this was unfolding in Britain, remain genuinely open. The orthodox view is that there was no significant contact between the Old World and the New before Columbus, and that apparent parallels between the cultures of the two hemispheres reflect common human tendencies rather than actual connections. This view is well supported by a great deal of evidence and represents the consensus of the relevant professional communities. But consensus in science is not the same as certainty, and the history of our understanding of human prehistory has been repeatedly revised in the direction of greater antiquity, greater complexity, and greater connectivity than the previous consensus allowed. The discovery of ancient DNA has already transformed what we know about human migrations and admixture in ways that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. The continued development of environmental DNA techniques, of satellite remote sensing, of isotope analysis, of increasingly precise radiocarbon dating will continue to reveal things that the current consensus doesn't have room for. What seems clear is that the ancient North Americans, particularly the mound builders of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and the monument builders of the northeastern coast, were engaged in projects of landscape transformation and astronomical observation that parallel the projects of Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain in their scale, their sophistication, and their apparent cosmological motivation. Whether those parallels reflect contact or convergence, or simply the common human tendency to build large things in relation to the sky and the dead and the community, the study of one illuminates the study of the other in ways that are genuinely productive. The researchers who work on Hopewell earthwork astronomy learn things that are relevant to understanding Stonehenge. The researchers who work on Neolithic monument landscapes in Britain develop frameworks that help interpret the Cahokian precinct. The conversation between the two bodies of evidence is valuable, regardless of whether physical contact between the two worlds ever occurred. And the question of what lies beneath the surface, in both Britain and North America, is still producing surprises. The widespread application of LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to create high-resolution, three-dimensional maps of the landscape, including through vegetation cover, has in recent years produced astonishing results in both Britain and the Americas. In Britain, LiDAR has revealed previously unknown features within and around known monument complexes, lines of pits around Stonehenge, traces of timber structures within the Stonehenge landscape that were invisible at ground level, the remains of Iron Age and Roman features beneath forest cover in areas that had not been surveyed. In Central America, LiDAR has revealed that the Maya lowlands were far more densely settled and intensively managed than anyone had realized, with cities connected by road networks, with agricultural infrastructure extending across vast areas, with a total population that rewrites our understanding of the scale of pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas. In the Amazon, LiDAR and remote sensing have revealed geometric earthworks, settlements, and landscape modifications across an enormous area, demonstrating that the Amazon was not a primeval wilderness, but a heavily managed cultural landscape before European contact. The lesson of LiDAR is the lesson of the whole field, the lesson of the stones and the bones and the buried ditches and the cursus monuments and the chalk figures and the bog bodies and the runic inscriptions in the ancient chambers. The evidence is always more than we can see with what we currently have. The picture is always being expanded and complicated by new tools and new questions. The past is not fixed and knowable and finished. It is ongoing, actively being revised, capable of producing genuine surprises in any season of excavation or analysis. Britain has been studied more intensively than almost any other landscape of comparable size on Earth, and it is still producing mysteries. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. That strangeness is not a problem to be solved. It's an invitation to keep asking. The people who built Stonehenge and Maeshowe and the Ness of Brodgar were not trying to leave puzzles for future archaeologists. They were trying to express things that mattered to them in the most permanent and impressive ways available to them, with the full expectation that the meaning of what they built would be comprehensible to the people who came after. They could not have known that the language in which they expressed that meaning, the cosmological framework, the shared understanding of what alignments with the winter solstice meant, the significance of decorated passage walls and sorted ancestral bones would become inaccessible. They built for permanence, and they achieved it. The stones remain. But the language in which those stones spoke is mostly gone, leaving only the formal elements, the shapes and orientations and materials behind. We read those formal elements as best we can, knowing that our reading is incomplete, knowing that we're working across a gap that no amount of archaeological sophistication will entirely bridge. And there is something valuable in that humility, something important about sitting with questions that may not be fully answerable, about being in the presence of evidence that exceeds our capacity to interpret it completely. In a culture that tends to reward certainty and to treat uncertainty as a failure rather than an honest acknowledgement of limits, the ancient stones of Britain have something to teach. Not the specific lessons the builders intended, which we cannot access, but the lesson of the stones themselves, which is this: things can endure beyond the comprehension of any single generation. Things can be present and significant and real without being fully understood. The depth of time is not a problem. It's the context within which everything that matters takes place. The last light of the winter solstice is fading now over Salisbury Plain. The shadows are long, and the stones are dark against a sky that is turning from gold to the particular shade of blue that arrives just before full dark. The blue that the photographers call the blue hour, the time when the world is neither day nor night. The stones stand in that light the way they have always stood, bearing whatever significance anyone brings to them, refusing to be reduced to any single meaning, holding in their silence the whole weight of what it means to be human in this particular place, across this particular span of time. The questions they raise will still be here in the morning, and the answers, the real answers, the ones that take into account everything we know and everything we don't, and everything that remains to be discovered, those are still being assembled from the evidence, grain by grain, stone by stone, bone by bone, from the depths of the British earth. Sleep now. Let the questions rest for a while. They'll keep. The stones are patient with time in ways that we, who live for such a brief flicker of it, can barely imagine. But we can try, and in the trying, in the reaching toward that deep strangeness, there is something that feels, in its own way, like coming home. There is one more thread that deserves to be followed before the night is fully done. One more layer of the British archaeological mystery that rarely makes it into the mainstream conversation, but that sits, quietly persistent, at the edge of what the evidence can support. It concerns water. Specifically, it concerns the relationship between the ancient peoples of Britain and the sacred landscape of rivers, springs, lakes, and the sea, a relationship so consistent across so many periods and so many different cultures that it begins to look less like a cultural preference and more like something fundamental about how human beings living in the specific geographical conditions of the British Isles organize their understanding of the world. Water is the thing that Britain has in abundance. It rains here. The rivers run. The springs emerge from the chalk and limestone with a constancy that farmers in drier climates can only envy. The coastline is enormous relative to the land area, intricate with estuaries and bays and sea locks and islands. To live in Britain is to live in intimate relationship with water in all its forms, and the ancient inhabitants of Britain expressed that relationship in their ritual practice with extraordinary consistency across millennia. The votive deposits in rivers and lakes and springs, the objects thrown or placed or offered to water, represent one of the largest and most continuous bodies of archaeological evidence in Britain, spanning from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age and into the Roman period, and, in the form of coins thrown into wishing wells, into the present day. The Thames is probably the single most significant river in Britain, archaeologically, not because it's the longest or the most dramatic, but because of the density and quality of the objects that have been recovered from it over centuries of dredging and construction work. The museum collections of London are full of things from the Thames. Bronze Age swords in perfect condition, their blades unscarred by use, clearly never intended as weapons, but as offerings to the river. Iron Age torques and helmets, Roman bronzes, medieval keys and buckles and coins. The Thames has been receiving offerings for at least 3,000 years, and the tradition of regarding it as in some sense sacred has never entirely stopped. The phrase Old Father Thames is not just a picturesque personification. It's the residue of a tradition of understanding the river as a being with personality and power, a tradition that goes back to a time when throwing a gold sword into the water was not a waste, but an investment, a gift to an entity whose goodwill was worth more than the gold. The Lake District, the upland lake country of Cumbria in northwestern England, is another landscape saturated with votive association. The lakes of Cumbria, Windermere, Ullswater, Thirlmere, Coniston Water, Buttermere have yielded Bronze Age and Iron Age objects recovered by fishermen and divers over the centuries, evidence of a consistent practice of water offering in a landscape whose dramatic geological character, the combination of high fells and deep cold lakes, lends itself particularly powerfully to a sense of the numinous, the natural landscape as the dwelling place of powerful beings. The lake itself, dark and cold and unfathomably deep by the standards of agricultural Britain, is a natural threshold between the known world and something else, and the ancient peoples of the region responded to it accordingly. The island sanctuaries are another expression of this relationship. Anglesey, the island off the northwest coast of Wales that the Romans specifically targeted in their campaign to destroy Druidic power, appears to have been a major sacred site, perhaps the major sacred site of late Iron Age Britain. Its accessibility by sea, while being separated from the mainland by water, made it the kind of naturally bounded, threshold space that appealed to Celtic religious sensibility. The groves of the Druids described in the Roman sources, with their altars and sacred trees and human sacrifices, occupied a landscape that was literally surrounded by water, separated from the ordinary world by the Strait of Menai. The Romans understood, or intuited, that destroying the physical sanctuary at Anglesey would strike at the heart of the religious and political authority of the Druids in Britain. They were right. It worked. The Arthurian tradition is saturated with water imagery in ways that reflect this deep association between the sacred and the aquatic in British culture. Excalibur comes from a lake given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake and returns to a lake at the end of his story. Avalon, the island to which Arthur is taken to heal of his wounds, is an island, accessible only by water, a threshold space between the ordinary world and the other world. The Grail quest leads repeatedly to locations associated with water, with the Fisher King's Court, near or on a river, with the healing waters that only the Grail can provide. These are not random choices of setting. They reflect a deep cultural encoding of water as the medium through which contact with the sacred is made, through which the boundaries between worlds are permeable, through which the dead are accompanied and the wounded healed and the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary. The chalk streams of southern England, the clear, fast-flowing rivers that drain the chalk downlands of Wiltshire, Hampshire and Berkshire, are among the most beautiful natural features of the British landscape, and they have been associated with sacred significance since at least the Neolithic. The Kennet, which flows past Avebury and was the original source of the River Kennet before it was modified by road building, rising from the Swallowhead Springs, was clearly significant to the builders of the Avebury complex in ways that relate to the whole sacred geography of that landscape. The Test and the Itchen of Hampshire are chalk streams of exceptional quality, and the fishing culture associated with them has deep roots in a relationship with the rivers that goes back far beyond the fly fishing traditions of the 19th century. The water itself, emerging cold and clear from the chalk aquifer that underlies the downs, is of a particular character, mineral-rich and strikingly transparent, with a quality that made it stand out to people for whom water from a spring or river was a constant miracle of the earth yielding what was necessary for life. The chalk figures and the chalk downlands are related in an interesting way, because the chalk itself, the material underlying the landscape, and exposed in the cliff faces of the coast and in the cuts made for hill forts and earthworks and the carved figures, is itself a remarkable substance. It is composed almost entirely of the remains of microscopic marine organisms, accumulated on the floor of a shallow tropical sea over millions of years during the Cretaceous period. The white cliffs of Dover, the iconic image of Britain seen from the sea, are the compressed bodies of billions of dead creatures from a world so different from the present that it barely seems related. Standing on the chalk downlands of Britain, walking on chalk, breathing air above chalk, you're standing on the accumulated dead of an ancient ocean. The white of the chalk figures is the white of those ancient shells and skeletons, exposed to the air when someone cut through the thin layer of soil above and revealed what lies beneath. Every chalk figure is a wound in the landscape that reveals the deep past, the limestone-rich history of a world before Britain was Britain. The flint that was the primary tool material of the Neolithic and Bronze Age peoples of southern Britain is also a product of the chalk, a silicious mineral that formed as nodules within the chalk beds from the silica of the same marine organisms that formed the chalk itself. The relationship between the people who built Stonehenge and the material they used for their tools, the flint that they knapped with such extraordinary skill, is a relationship between human craft and geological deep time, between the living hand and the accumulated dead of an ancient sea. They didn't know this. They knew the flint as the best material for cutting and scraping and piercing, the material that held an edge and could be made sharp beyond anything organic. But the material itself, the stuff of their daily lives and their essential technology, was itself a kind of compressed history of the earth, a record of life and death and transformation across spans of time that dwarf even the already enormous spans of human prehistory. This is the final mystery of Britain, and it's not really a mystery at all in the sense of something hidden and waiting to be revealed. It's the mystery of time itself, of how the present moment sits on top of everything that came before, of how every act of human habitation and ceremony and construction is simultaneously new and ancient, participating in a chain of cause and effect that extends further in both directions than comprehension can follow. The stones of Stonehenge are made of material that formed over hundreds of millions of years in geological processes entirely indifferent to human presence. They were quarried and shaped and moved by human hands at a specific moment in history for reasons that were intensely meaningful to the people involved. They have been sitting in that specific arrangement in that specific landscape for 5,000 years, and they will almost certainly continue to sit there for thousands more years after everyone alive today is dead, and the societies that produced us are as remote from the future as the Neolithic is from us. In that context, every question about why and how and what it meant is genuinely small, genuinely temporary, genuinely contingent on the particular concerns and methods of the specific historical moment asking them. The stones don't care about the question. They've already outlasted a dozen different frameworks for asking it, and will outlast dozens more. What endures is not the answer, but the relationship, the ongoing human need to stand in the presence of things older and more permanent than ourselves, and to ask again and again, what does this mean? What happened here? Who were they? What did they believe? How did they live? And to take the partial, uncertain, always incomplete answer and find it somehow sufficient. Find it in the way that the light coming through the passage at Newgrange on the winter solstice morning is sufficient. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that something real happened here, and that it matters, and that the wondering itself is part of what being human means. The night is deep now. Britain is dark and quiet under its winter stars. The ancient stones standing in their fields, the chalk figures waiting under their thin cover of turf, the bog bodies resting in their peat, the bones in the long barrows undisturbed in their chambers. All of it here, all of it patient, all of it waiting for the next morning and the next question and the next generation of people who will stand in this landscape and feel, in their bones before they feel it, in their minds, that something happened here that was real and significant, and that it reaches forward across the centuries and touches the present moment with a weight that is neither burden nor blessing, but simply the fact of continuity, of being part of a story so much larger than any single chapter, that the chapter itself, however fully it is lived, will always be incomplete. Let that incompleteness be restful rather than troubling. Let the unanswered questions settle gently into the dark, alongside everything else that has been set aside for the night. The digging will continue in the morning. The evidence will continue to accumulate. The picture will continue to complicate and deepen and surprise. And the stones will still be there when it does, as they have always been, waiting. Rest now. Drift down into the quiet beneath the questions. The deeper we go, the older and stranger and more wonderful it gets. And at the very bottom of it, underneath everything, is simply the fact of this place, this island, these stones, these people, this long, strange story that is still being told. There is one thing more to say before sleep takes hold completely, and it concerns the sky above Britain, the same sky that has been watched from this island since the first human eyes opened here, however many hundreds of thousands of years ago that was. The sky is not a passive backdrop to the story of ancient Britain. It's an active participant, a presence that the ancient peoples of this island attended to with a seriousness and a precision that modern people, who have largely stopped looking up, can barely imagine. The Neolithic farmers who built their passage tombs aligned to the winter solstice sunrise were not just making an architectural gesture. They were making a cosmological statement, asserting that the human world and the celestial world were in alignment, that the structures built by human hands participated in the greater structure of the universe as revealed by the movements of the sun and moon and stars. That assertion is not trivial. It required centuries of observation to achieve the precision it achieved. It required social structures capable of sustaining that observation across generations and transmitting the conclusions to those who would eventually build the monuments. And it required a belief, perhaps so fundamental to these communities that it barely needed stating, that the relationship between the human world and the celestial world mattered, that getting the alignment right was important enough to justify the extraordinary labor of making it perfect. The Pleiades, the cluster of stars known in many cultures as the Seven Sisters, appear in the mythology and ritual calendars of peoples across the globe with a frequency that has attracted attention from researchers for well over a century. In Britain and in the wider Celtic world, the Pleiades are associated with the festival of Samhain, the beginning of winter, which falls when the Pleiades rise at sunset and are at their highest point in the sky at midnight around the 1st of November. The modern Halloween is a very distant descendant of this festival, but the astronomical basis of the original festival reflects the same kind of careful skywatching that produced the monument alignments. The agricultural calendar of the ancient British world, with its 4 great festivals at the midpoints of the seasons, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lughnasadh, was organized not just around the solar year, but around the movements of other celestial objects. The people who kept that calendar were not just farmers marking the seasons. They were observers of the sky whose observations organized the whole of their ceremonial and agricultural and social life. The stars of Britain are the same stars that shine over North America, over Orkney, over the passage tomb builders of Ireland, over the Hopewell earthwork builders of Ohio. They're the same stars that watch the bog people sink into the peat, and the Romans build their wall, and the Vikings scratch their names in the ancient chambers. They're the same stars visible through the tiny window of a hospital room, through the gap in a curtain, from a back garden on a clear night, from the window of a car on a motorway in the dark. The same ancient light falling on whatever eyes are open to receive it. Whatever questions those eyes are carrying, whatever they're looking for, in the dark, at this time of night, from wherever they are. The stars don't answer, but they keep shining. And sometimes that's enough. Sleep now, let it come. The island is dark and old and full of things we don't yet understand. And they'll all still be there in the morning, patient as chalk, quiet as standing water, waiting for the next question. Good night. One last thought before sleep settles completely. It has to do with why these stories, the old stories of stone and bone and sky, have such power over the sleeping mind. There is a theory, never fully proven, but never entirely dismissed, that the reason the ancient landscapes of Britain feel familiar even to people who have never visited them, the reason that standing stones and chalk downlands and misty mornings over prehistoric earthworks appear in dreams and stories and paintings and songs across the whole of the English-speaking world, is that the images are not purely cultural. They are encoded somewhere older than culture. The landscape of the ancestral home, whatever that home may have been, for any given lineage, is a landscape that leaves traces in the way the mind organizes its experience of place and belonging, and the ancient. The people who built Stonehenge are among the ancestors of millions of people alive today, and the landscape they built in, the chalk plains and the grey skies and the green hills, is a landscape that many of those millions have never seen, but that many of them would recognize somehow, if they did see it. as the place that a deep part of them has been searching for. This is speculation of a romantic kind that the scientific mind tends to distrust. But the feelings it attempts to describe are real, and they are reported too consistently by too many people in too many contexts to be entirely dismissed as sentimentality. The ancient places of Britain do something to people. They produce in people who are sensitive to them a kind of recognition, a sense of having been somewhere before, a feeling of contact with something much older and larger than the individual self. Whether that feeling reflects genuine ancestral memory or simply the accumulated weight of cultural association with places that have been treated as significant for thousands of years, or something else entirely that we don't yet have the vocabularies to describe, it is real in its effects. It makes people stand quietly in fields they would otherwise walk through quickly. It makes people come back to the same sites again and again. It makes people, lying in beds in the dark, listening to stories about stone and time, feel something that is not quite sadness and not quite joy, but is somewhere in the territory between them. In the territory that is, perhaps, closest to the feeling of being fully and completely alive in a world much older than yourself. That feeling is worth protecting. It's worth making space for. And one of the ways to make space for it is to let the old stories settle into you, slowly, in the dark, without demanding that they resolve into clear conclusions or definitive answers. Let the questions rest in you the way the stones rest in the earth. Heavy, patient, old, and let yourself rest too. The island is still there in the dark. The stones are still standing. The chalk is still white beneath the thin cover of grass. The springs are still emerging cold and clear from the ground. Everything that has been here for thousands of years will be here again in the morning, and so, with any luck, will you. Good night, rest well. Dream of old stones and winter light and the long, patient story of a very old island still being told. Britain holds its breath in the final hours of the night. The last embers of any fire lit in a farmhouse kitchen near Avebury have long since cooled. The owls have stopped calling across the Wiltshire fields, and somewhere beneath the quiet surface of this sleeping island, the deep layers of its incomprehensible past continue their slow dialogue with each other. Stone to chalk to clay, bone to soil to memory, question to silence to the next morning's light. The stones endure, the night endures, and so do we, always.